It has been my privilege, across the many years of my association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, to be roused from perfectly comfortable sleep by matters of no small consequence. I have been pulled from my bed by poisonings, by disappearances, by coded letters arriving in the dead of night, and on one occasion by a trained ferret whose significance I shall not here elaborate upon, as Holmes never permitted me to publish the particulars. But of all the untimely summonses that punctuated my life at Baker Street and beyond, none arrived with quite the same weight of dread nor the same peculiar trembling of the messenger's hands as the knock that came to my door on the 14th of November, in the year 1898. I was at that hour enjoying a dreamless sleep in my study, having retired rather later than usual. My wife was visiting her sister in Bath, and I had spent the evening in the company of a medical journal and a glass of rather fine Madeira, neither of which had provided sufficient stimulation to keep me alert past 11. It was, therefore, somewhere in the vicinity of 2:30 in the morning when a sound penetrated my unconsciousness, not the bold, confident knock of a man with a clear conscience, but something furtive and rapid, the kind of knock that wishes to be heard by one person only, and dreads the attention of the world. I sat up. The fire had burned low. The room was cold in that particular way of late autumn London, a cold that carries with it the smell of coal smoke and river damp, as though the Thames itself breathed through the walls. I pulled on my dressing-gown, lit the bedside candle, and made my way to the door. The man standing in my threshold was known to me, though not well. He was Inspector Cornelius Waverley of the Metropolitan Police, a solid and reliable officer of the middle rank whose name I had encountered twice in Holmes's case notes, though he had never previously visited me directly. He was perhaps 40, broad-shouldered, with a moustache of the old soldier variety and eyes that, even in the candlelight, I could see were stripped of their professional composure. He had been running. There was evidence of exertion about his collar and at his temples, and beneath his overcoat he wore, I noticed with some surprise, not his uniform but the clothes of a man interrupted in the middle of private life. He had been called, as I had been called, from somewhere he had not expected to leave. "Dr. Watson," he said, and his voice was low enough that I instinctively leaned forward, "I beg your pardon for the hour. I would not have come to you at all, except that Mr. Holmes—" "Come in," I said, and stood aside. He entered, removing his hat and holding it as men hold things when they do not know what to do with their hands. I guided him to the chair nearest the dying fire and threw on another coal. "Holmes is not at Baker Street," Waverley said. "I went there first. Mrs. Hudson tells me he departed yesterday afternoon and left no word. I had hoped the matter is urgent, Doctor. I dared to hope you might know his whereabouts, or that you might come yourself and send for him after." "Come where?" I said, though something in his face had already begun to tell me the answer would be extraordinary. Waverley set his hat upon his knee and looked at me with the expression of a man delivering a sentence he has rehearsed and still cannot quite bring himself to say. "Buckingham Palace," he said. "The east corridor of the ground floor adjacent to the Belgian suite. There is blood on the marble floor, Doctor, a considerable quantity of it. And there is no body. I dressed in 4 minutes. I am not ashamed to admit it. I have been a military man, and I know the value of swift preparation." By the time I had my coat buttoned and my bag in hand, Waverley had consumed a hasty cup of tea that I had pressed upon him and recovered some portion of his professional bearing, though not all of it. The particulars he provided during our hansom cab journey through the silent, gaslit streets were enough to confirm that whatever awaited us was unlike anything in his considerable experience of London crime. The palace had not, so far as official record was concerned, been breached. The Queen herself was at Windsor for the fortnight, a detail that Waverley communicated with the careful neutrality of a man who understands that certain facts carry political weight beyond their immediate significance. The skeleton staff remaining at Buckingham Palace included members of the household, a small rotation of royal footmen and ladies' maids, attending to the upkeep of the principal rooms, and the customary detachment of guards whose duty it was to prevent exactly the sort of event that appeared, none the less, to have occurred. The blood had been discovered at 20 minutes past midnight by one James Crail, a senior footman of 17 years' service, who had been making his final rounds of the ground-floor corridors before retiring. Crail had immediately and commendably secured the corridor, roused the palace steward, a Mr. Aldous Fenwick, described by Waverley as an efficient man now quite undone by events, and contacted the police. all without disturbing the scene further. Scotland Yard had dispatched Waverley within the half-hour. "And Holmes?" I asked. We were crossing St. James's Park now, the bare trees standing like sentinels in the fog. The palace was beginning to resolve itself from the murk ahead, its facade pale and enormous. "No sign of him. I sent a constable round to Baker Street as a precaution, but—" Waverley paused. "Doctor, I will be frank with you. This is not a matter that can bear the usual methods. If word escapes that someone has bled, perhaps died inside Buckingham Palace, in rooms adjacent to the Belgian suite, with Her Majesty due to return within 10 days. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Then we must be quick, I said, and we must be accurate. That is precisely why I want Holmes. So do I said. But you shall have to make do with me for the present. The east gate was opened for us by a constable who wore the expression of a man who has been told to speak to no one and is finding the instruction difficult. We were met inside by Mr. Aldous Fenwick, the palace steward, a thin and precise man of perhaps 60 whose normal composure had cracked along very specific lines, like good china dropped on a stone floor. He shook my hand with both of his, which surprised me, and immediately began to speak in a rapid, controlled whisper that carried the cadences of a man fighting very hard not to raise his voice. "The footman Crail is waiting in the butler's pantry," he said. "I have kept him apart from the others. There are 6 other staff present in the house tonight. I have accounted for all of them. They are in their rooms or have been brought to the servants' hall. None of them was near the east corridor after 10 o'clock, as far as I can establish. The guards have been questioned and confirm no entry or exit through any exterior point between 9 in the evening and the discovery. I have touched nothing in the corridor. Nothing has been moved." "Excellent," I said, with more confidence than I felt. Holmes, I knew, would already have noticed a dozen things about Fenwick himself, the particular distress in his voice, the mud on his left boot that didn't match the palace's interior, the faint smell of something I could not yet identify that clung to his cuffs. I was doing my best to observe, but I am always most aware in such moments of the gap between my capacities and those of my extraordinary friend. We were led through corridors of considerable splendor, though they wore a different character at this hour than they would in daylight, the gilt and velvet muted by shadow, the portraits of monarchs watching our passage with painted indifference. Our footsteps were absorbed by the long runner of carpet, and then returned to us in brief, sharp intervals as we crossed a section of bare floor. The gas lamps had been turned low for the night, and Fenwick carried a lantern that threw our shadows long behind us. The east corridor was blocked at both ends by constables. Waverley spoke briefly to the nearer one, and we were admitted. I have seen violence in many forms. I served in Afghanistan, and I have walked with Holmes through some of the darkest passages that London crime has provided. I do not consider myself a man who is easily shaken by the sight of blood. But what greeted me in that corridor, pale marble, grand proportions, the ghostly suggestion of royal portraits above the dado rail, and then there, in the lamplight, the dark and unmistakable stains spreading across 3 feet of floor, had an effect upon me that I find difficult to articulate. It was the quantity that struck first. This was not a cut finger, not a minor wound dressed and walked away from. The stain on the marble, dark as spilled ink in the lamplight, was the kind that a medical man reads with professional gravity, and the reading it gave me was unambiguous. Whoever had lost this blood had lost a dangerous amount of it. And yet there was no body, no drag marks that I could immediately perceive, though I reminded myself that such things required the full examination Holmes would provide. No weapon visible, no disturbed furniture, no shattered object, no evidence of a struggle beyond the blood itself. The corridor was otherwise pristine. A painting hung straight upon the wall. A console table stood undisturbed with its vase of late autumn flowers still arranged to careful symmetry. The runner of carpet showed no irregular disturbance. I crouched beside the stain and studied it without touching. Waverley stood behind me. Fenwick remained at the corridor entrance, unwilling or unable to approach further. "How long?" Waverley asked, meaning, how old was the blood? "Several hours," I said. "It has dried at the perimeter. The centre still retains some viscosity. 8 hours, perhaps. Perhaps fewer, given the cold." I looked up and around, systematically, the way Holmes had taught me by example across many years of watching him work. The walls, the ceiling, the windows, long curtained windows whose heavy drapes fell to the floor. One of the curtains I noticed then hung at a fractionally different angle than its pair. It was the smallest of asymmetries. I might not have caught it at all, had I not been making a conscious effort to see. I rose and moved toward it. Waverley followed. Behind the curtain, against the cold glass of the window, there was a smear of blood at shoulder height. A handprint, partial, the fingers spread as though someone had braced themselves against the glass. And on the floor beneath the curtain, barely visible where the carpet met the wall, a small and distinctive object. A cufflink. Gold by the look of it, with an engraved cartouche at its face that I could not read in the available light. I did not touch it. "Inspector," I said, straightening, "send for Holmes again? Send everywhere his clubs, his contacts, any address Mrs. Hudson may know. Tell whoever you send that it is urgent beyond the ordinary meaning of the word." "You think it so serious, then?" I looked again at the blood on the palace marble, at the dark and generous evidence of human crisis played out in a corridor of the most famous royal residence in the world, and I considered the cufflink, and the handprint, and the absolute baffling absence of a body. "I think," I said carefully, "that this is the most singular thing I have encountered in 20 years of singular things, and I think that without Sherlock Holmes we are standing in the dark." Waverley was already moving toward the corridor entrance. I remained behind for a moment, alone with the lamplight and the stain, and I had the peculiar and not entirely comfortable sensation that the palace, its portraits, its marble, its long and watching silence was keeping something from me. That the answer was already here, written in the language of things seen, and that I lacked only the capacity to read it. I would have to find Holmes, and Holmes, as would shortly become apparent, had already found something else entirely. There are men in this world who, when they vanish, leave behind them an absence as unremarkable as the space between furniture. And then there is Sherlock Holmes, whose disappearance from any room, any street, any city, leaves a shape behind it, an outline, a pressure, the way a hand leaves its impression in soft clay long after the hand has withdrawn. Even Scotland Yard, which maintained a professional ambivalence toward my friend's methods, felt his absence that night as a particular kind of deprivation, the way a surgeon's team might feel the absence of the surgeon. I returned to Baker Street at 4:30 in the morning, having left Waverley with instructions as clear as I could make them. The cufflink was to be photographed and its position precisely recorded before any removal. The curtain and the handprint were not to be disturbed. The footman Crail was to be kept available for questioning, and the blood itself was to be documented in every measurable dimension before any cleaning was contemplated, regardless of the household staff's understandable desire to erase the evidence of the evening from the palace's immaculate floors. Whether all of this would be adhered to in my absence I could not guarantee. Waverley was a conscientious officer, but the palace had its own hierarchies, and I had already perceived that Mr. Fenwick, the steward, was a man who experienced physical distress in the presence of disorder. Mrs. Hudson met me at the Baker Street door before I had raised my hand to knock, which told me she had not slept, and had been watching from the window. She was in her dressing gown, her grey hair gathered back with the brisk practicality of a woman who has long since ceased to be surprised by what the night brings to her doorstep. "He's not come back," she said, before I could speak. "Have you any idea where he went?" "Yesterday afternoon around 3. He dressed not himself, you understand. He dressed down. Old coat, the terrible scarf. He took his stick, but not his hat. Left in a cab heading east." I turned this over as she admitted me and set about making tea with the quiet efficiency that was her great gift to both of us across so many years of irregular hours. East could mean Whitechapel, Stepney, Limehouse, the docks, a dozen different Londons, each with its own code, its own silence, its own willingness to close around a man and keep him. "Did he say anything? Leave any note?" "Only that I was not to worry, which is precisely what he always says when he intends that I should. I sat by the fire in Holmes's chair, a liberty the first rarely took, but the hour and the cold and the weight of the evening pressed me into it, and considered what I knew. Holmes had departed the previous afternoon, hours before the blood was discovered, dressed for concealment. He had gone east. He had told Mrs. Hudson nothing of substance. These facts arranged themselves in my mind into a picture that was more suggestive than conclusive. Holmes had been on a case before any of this began, which meant either that the matter at the palace was known to him in advance, or that he was pursuing something adjacent to it, something that ran along the same seam of London's hidden life, and had not yet intersected with the event in the East Corridor. Or, and this was the third possibility, the one I turned away from without fully examining, he was somewhere he could not easily leave. I did not sleep. I sat with my tea and my notes and the fire, and I waited for the kind of knock that does not apologize for the hour. It came at 10 minutes past 7. Not a knock, in fact, but the sound of the street door, which had been left on the latch, and then steps on the stair, 2 sets of them, one brisk and familiar, one heavier and slower. I was on my feet before the door opened. Holmes entered first. He looked, in the grey morning light that came through the Baker Street windows, like a man who had spent the night in places that do not encourage comfort. His coat, the old one, the one Mrs. Hudson had noted, was damp at the shoulders from fog, and showed a quantity of grime about the cuffs consistent with an environment I preferred not to immediately identify. His face was sharp with the particular animation that always attended him in the early hours of an investigation. His eyes were bright, febrile almost, the way they grew when the mind behind them was running at a pace the body could barely sustain. Behind him came a man I did not know. He was perhaps 35, short and powerfully built, with the broad hands and flattened knuckles of a man who has worked with them all his life. He wore a docker's jacket and a cap he did not remove, and he looked around Baker Street's sitting-room with the careful expressionlessness of someone who has learned, in whatever life he has led, not to show his thoughts to strangers. "Watson." Holmes stripped off his coat and threw it over the basket chair with his customary indifference to its fate. "You've been at the palace." It was not a question. I opened my mouth. "Mud on your left boot, Eastgate variety. There's a particular clay composition along that path that one doesn't find elsewhere in that neighborhood. You've been crouching on your right knee, the trousers show it. And you have the expression of a man who has seen something he cannot explain, which in a physician of your experience is rather more revealing than you might wish." Holmes. And Waverley sent 3 constables to find me during the night, which means it is police business, palace business, and urgent. Sit down, Watson. This," he gestured to the man who had followed him in, "is Mr. Thomas Ketch. He will wait in the kitchen, if Mrs. Hudson will accommodate him, which she will, as she is already at the kettle." The man called Ketch said nothing. He looked at me once, steadily, and then followed Holmes's gesture toward the kitchen with the compliance of a man accustomed to following instructions he does not fully understand, but has reason to trust. The door closed. Holmes dropped into his own chair and reached for his pipe, then apparently thought better of it and set it down. He pressed his fingertips together in the steeple that meant his mind was in full operation. "Tell me," he said. I told him. I gave him everything: the corridor, the blood, the curtain, the handprint, the cuff-link. I described Fenwick's manner, Waverley's distress, the footman's account of the discovery as Waverley had relayed it to me. Holmes listened with his eyes half closed and his face arranged in perfect stillness, the way he always listened when something genuinely interested him, which was a different stillness from the one he wore when he was merely being polite. When I finished, there was a silence of perhaps 15 seconds. "The cuff-link," he said. "Describe it again." Perhaps 18 carat. By the color and weight of appearance I did not handle it. The face bore an engraved cartouche, rectangular, with what appeared to be initials, though I could not read them at that distance in that light. Initials or a cipher? I paused. I cannot say with certainty. There was a regularity to it that suggested letters rather than a decorative motif. But I confess I could not be sure. Holmes made a sound that was not quite satisfaction, and not quite dissatisfaction, but inhabited the space between them. He rose abruptly, moved to the window, and stood looking down at Baker Street, where the morning's first hansom cabs were beginning to move through the thinning fog. "You haven't slept," I said. "No." "And the man Ketch?" Holmes turned from the window. In the better light I could see now that there was something else about him, a contained energy, a restraint, as though he were carrying a piece of knowledge that he was not yet ready to release even to me. I have known him long enough to read the signs. Holmes withholds information not from duplicity, but from a kind of intellectual caution, the knowledge that a premature disclosure can alter the behavior of everyone involved and compromise what he has so carefully arranged. "Mr. Ketch," Holmes said carefully, "is a man who carries cargo on the Millwall docks and who, 3 nights ago, saw something he was not meant to see. I have been engaged since yesterday afternoon in persuading him that the safest course available to him is to tell me what that something was." "And has he told you?" He is in the process of deciding." Holmes moved back to his chair, sat, and this time did take up his pipe. Though he did not light it, he turned it in his fingers, an old habit of ratiocination. "Watson, I must ask you something, and I need you to answer not as my friend but as an observer of fact. The blood. You are a physician, and you have seen a great deal of it in various conditions." "Yes." "In your judgment, your considered medical judgment, absent any sentimentality, was the quantity of blood you observed consistent with the survival of the person who lost it?" The question hit me with a precision I had been avoiding since I left the palace. I had circled it professionally, noting the stain's dimensions and character and age, making my clinical observations. But the conclusion those observations pointed toward was one that carried implications too large for the corridor itself. "It is possible to survive such a loss," I said slowly, "if the wound was to a limb and if the bleeding was controlled quickly. If the wound was to the trunk—" I paused. "The quantity was considerable, Holmes, at the outer range of what a person might lose and retain consciousness, perhaps beyond it." Holmes nodded once, as though I had confirmed something he had already known. "There are, then," he said, "two principal possibilities. Either someone was injured in that corridor grievously, possibly mortally, and was removed from the scene by a party, or parties who had reason to conceal both the injury and the person's existence. Or he paused. "Or," I prompted, "or the blood is not what it appears to be." He held up a hand before I could speak. "I do not say this with confidence. I say it as a possibility that the evidence does not yet exclude. The location, the quantity, the absence of a body, the apparent impossibility of entry or exit, these things, taken together, do not yet resolve into a single narrative. They resolve into two or three, and I have not yet gathered sufficient evidence to select among them." "But you have a preference," I said, knowing him. Holmes looked at me with something that might, in another man, have been called amusement. "I have a direction," he said, "which is not quite the same thing. And before I share it, I need to know what Thomas Ketch saw on the Millwall docks." As if on cue, the kitchen door opened, and Mrs. Hudson appeared with a tray of breakfast things, followed by the man Ketch, who had, I noticed, been given a mug of tea of his own, and who seemed, in consequence, marginally less guarded than he had been on his arrival. He took his former position by the door, standing rather than sitting, and looked at Holmes with the expression of a man who has spent the night making a decision. "All right," Ketch said. His voice was low and flat, with the residue of some northern country beneath the London overlay. "I'll tell you what I saw. But I want your word, his word," he nodded toward me, "that my name goes nowhere near whatever comes of it." "You have my word as a gentleman," I said immediately. Holmes said nothing. He simply looked at Ketch with the steady attention of a man who does not deal in words when the truth of a thing can be read more directly. Whatever Ketch found in that look appeared to satisfy him. He pulled his cap from his head, turned it once in his hands, and began to speak. What Thomas Ketch told us in the sitting-room at Baker Street, in the thin November morning light, with the fire burning and the sounds of the waking street below coming up through the window-glass, was the thing that transformed a baffling and peculiar incident at Buckingham Palace into something altogether darker and more urgent. But that account and what Holmes made of it belongs to the chapter that follows. For at that precise moment, before Ketch had spoken more than a dozen sentences, there came another knock at the door. This one had the sharp, unambiguous authority of official business, and Waverley's voice carried up the stair before Mrs. Hudson could reach the landing. "Mr. Holmes!" "Dr. Watson, there has been a development." Holmes was out of his chair before the sentence was finished. The pipe was on the table, the old coat was in his hand, and his eyes had that particular brightness that I had learned, across long years, to read as a compound emotion. Intellectual delight and something very close to alarm, held in careful, characteristic balance. "Ketch," he said, pausing at the door, "you will remain here. You will speak to no one. Mrs. Hudson will see to you." He looked at me. "Call me Watson." I always came. The development, as Waverley called it, was this. A second stain had been found. Not in the east corridor, that would have been too simple a continuation of what had already been established. This second mark was discovered at 6:30 in the morning by a housemaid named Agnes Pryor, who had been sent to prepare the Belgian suite for a diplomatic visit expected the following week. She had gone about her duties with the unremarkable competence of long practice, until she reached the suite's private antechamber, a small withdrawing room that connected the suite properly to the main corridor, and found upon the handle of the interior door a smear of dried blood, brownish and unmistakable, no larger than a man's palm. She had not screamed to her considerable credit and Watson's professional respect, but had instead gone directly to Mr. Fenwick, who had gone directly to Waverley, who had come directly to Baker Street. Holmes absorbed all of this in the cab without interrupting Waverley once. He sat with his coat pulled close and his chin slightly lowered, listening in the way that I can only describe as total, as though every faculty were bent simultaneously toward the account, sifting, weighing, discarding. When Waverley finished, Holmes asked 3 questions in rapid succession. The housemaid Agnes Pryor, how long in service? 11 years, Waverley said. Fenwick vouches for her absolutely. The antechamber door, does it connect directly to the east corridor or through an intermediate passage? Waverley paused. There is a short passage, perhaps 15 feet. And the door handle, interior or exterior face of the door? Waverley blinked. I believe the interior. The side facing into the antechamber. Holmes settled back against the cab cushion and said nothing further. I watched his face. There was something there, a flicker, quickly suppressed, that I recognized as the expression Holmes wore when a small detail had resolved into something larger and more significant than its apparent size. He did not share it. He rarely did at this stage, and I had learned across many years not to press him, as pressing only made him more reticent, not less. The fog had thinned somewhat with the morning, though London's November light was doing its customary best to be indistinguishable from twilight. By the time we arrived at the palace's east gate, the clock on a nearby church had struck the 3/4 hour past 8. Fenwick was waiting for us at the interior entrance, looking, if anything, worse than he had appeared during the night. A second encounter with disorder, I supposed, is harder than the first, because by then one has had the interval of horror during which the mind rehearses the implications. Holmes greeted him with the brisk pleasantness he reserved for moments when he had no time for ordinary social friction. "Mr. Fenwick, you have kept the antechamber sealed?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes." "Nothing touched since the housemaid raised the alarm. The east corridor as well?" "As Dr. Watson instructed." Holmes glanced at me with something that might have been approval or might simply have been acknowledgment. With Holmes the distinction was sometimes academic. "Take me to the corridor first." What followed was one of those examinations that, having observed Holmes conduct them 100 times, I never cease to find remarkable. There is nothing theatrical in the way he works, or rather there is theatre, but it is incidental, a by-product of the methodology rather than its purpose. He does not perform deduction, he practices it, with the focused attention of a craftsman for whom every surface is a text, and every text is worth reading. He entered the east corridor and stood still for perhaps 30 seconds, simply looking. Not at the blood, not at the curtain, at the whole of the space, the dimensions of it, the placement of furniture, the angles of the windows, the height of the gas fixtures, the precise fall of the morning light as it came through the long panes above the curtain rail. His head moved in the small, systematic increments of a man taking an inventory, and his hands were in his pockets and perfectly still. Then he moved. He went first to the console table, the one I had noted as undisturbed, with its symmetrically arranged vase of flowers, and crouched beside its legs. He produced his lens from his breast pocket and examined the floor beside the table's right front leg for perhaps 20 seconds. Then he rose and moved along the wall away from the blood toward the painting I had noted hanging straight and undisturbed upon the wall. He looked at the painting for a moment. Not at the painting itself, at its frame, and specifically at the wall immediately around the frame, at the point where the lower right corner of the frame met the plaster. He leaned close. Then he leaned back and looked at the hanging wire and the picture hook above. He said nothing. He moved to the blood. Here he was most meticulous, and I found myself holding my breath in the way I always do during these examinations, as though breathing too loudly might disturb the atmosphere his attention required. He circled the stain without approaching it, 3 slow circuits of increasing closeness, studying it from standing height, and then from a crouch, and then, in one remarkable moment, from almost floor level, his cheek nearly touching the marble as he looked along the surface of the floor. He examined the edges of the stain with his lens. He examined the area immediately surrounding it, the clean marble beyond its perimeter, for several minutes, moving with a patience that contrasted strangely with the urgency I felt pressing in from every direction. Then he went to the curtain. He did not pull it back immediately. He stood before it and looked at the way it hung, the angle and the fall of it, the place where it touched the floor. He looked at the rings on the rail above. Then, with the delicate touch of a man handling something breakable, he drew it aside. The handprint was there, as I had left it. The cufflink was on the floor beneath. Holmes examined the handprint through his lens for a long time. Then he crouched over the cufflink and studied it for an even longer one. He did not touch it. He turned his head to look at it from multiple angles, and once he produced a small folded paper from his pocket, on which he appeared to make a brief notation. He stood and released the curtain back to its position. He turned to me. His expression was neutral, which with Holmes means the opposite of what it means in other men. "Waverley," he said, without looking at the inspector, "the footman who made the discovery Crail. I wish to speak with him now before we go to the antechamber." "I'll have him brought," Waverley said, and stepped to the corridor entrance to speak with the constable there. Holmes moved to my side and said very quietly, so that only I could hear, "What was the first thing you noticed when you entered this corridor last night, Watson?" "Your instinct before your clinical training took over." I thought about it honestly. "The quantity," I said. "The amount of blood seemed disproportionate to the otherwise undisturbed state of the room." Holmes held my eyes for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Disproportionate. That is the word." And then Waverley was returning with Crail behind him, and Holmes's expression had shifted back to its professional neutrality, and I was left to turn the word over in my mind and wonder what precisely he had meant by it. James Crail was a man whose 17 years of royal service had given him a bearing that only partially concealed the strain of the night. He was perhaps 50, lean and straight-backed, with the careful hands and measured movements of a man trained to move through rooms of value without disturbing them. His face was composed with the effort of a man who knows his composure is expected of him, and is not entirely sure he can sustain it. Holmes put him at ease with a facility that always impressed me, asking him first about his length of service, the nature of his nightly rounds, the route he customarily took questions whose answers were in some sense irrelevant to the investigation, but whose asking communicated respect for the man's experience and established a tone of professional consultation rather than interrogation. By the time Holmes reached the events of the previous evening, Crail had settled somewhat into himself. "You entered the corridor from which end?" Holmes asked. "The west end, sir. I always proceed west to east on the ground floor." "And you had been through this corridor on a previous round earlier in the evening?" "At 9:30, sir." "It was clear at that time." "Entirely clear?" "You would have noticed the blood." "I would have noticed it immediately, sir. The floor was clean." Holmes nodded slowly. "When you entered at 20 past midnight and saw the stain, what did you do first? Before you did anything else, before you raised the alarm, what was your immediate action?" Crail paused, as though the question were unexpected. I stopped, sir. I stood still." "For how long?" "A moment, perhaps 2. "And in those 2 moments, before you moved to raise the alarm, what did you hear?" The pause this time was longer. Crail looked at Holmes with the expression of a man who has not been asked this question before, and is now realizing that he should have been. "I don't know that He stopped. He looked at the floor and then back at Holmes. "There was something," he said slowly. "I attributed it to the building. Old buildings make sounds." "What kind of sound?" "Movement. Very faint. Somewhere above." "Above the corridor?" "Above, or it was difficult to place, sir. A movement and then nothing. I thought it was the building settling. I thought He shook his head. "I thought nothing of it. I found the blood and thought of nothing else." Holmes thanked him with a warmth that was genuine, I think. In the way Holmes's warmth is always genuine when someone has given him something useful without knowing they have done so. Crail was released to the care of Fenwick, and Holmes stood for a moment in the corridor with his hands clasped behind his back, looking up at the ceiling. I looked up with him. The ceiling of the east corridor was ornamental plaster, divided into coffered panels, each perhaps 3 feet square, set perhaps 14 feet above the floor. Between 2 of the panels, in the seam where the cornice met the wall, there was, I had to look twice to be certain, a very faint, very fine line of disturbance in the plaster dust that had accumulated in the cornice's decorative recess, as though something had rested there, or passed along it. "Holmes," I began. "The antechamber," he said. The antechamber of the Belgian suite was a small room, graciously appointed, with pale blue silk on the walls and furniture of the French style that managed to be simultaneously delicate and authoritative. The door to the corridor, the door whose interior handle bore the blood-stain, was at the east end of the room. The door to the suite proper was at the west. A single window, currently curtained, faced south toward the inner courtyard. Holmes examined the door handle with minute care. Then he examined the door itself, its frame, its hinges, the keyhole, the small gap between the door's lower edge and the floor. He crouched and looked through this gap for a long moment. He rose and went to the window. He opened the curtain. The inner courtyard was visible below, grey in the November morning, its cobblestones damp with overnight condensation. Holmes looked at the courtyard for a considerable time. Then he looked at the window frame itself, then at the curtains. Then, and here I watched him with particular attention, he turned his back to the window and looked at the room as someone standing in that window's light would look at it, and something shifted in his face, the same flicker I had seen in the cab, but larger now and less quickly suppressed. He turned to Waverley. "The inner courtyard," he said. "Is it accessible from the east corridor?" "Through the servants' passage, yes." "And from outside?" "From the palace grounds?" Waverley hesitated. "There is a gate. It's kept locked." "Kept locked," Holmes repeated, with the precise emphasis he reserved for phrases that interested him not for what they said, but for what they assumed. "I should like to see that gate." We went to see the gate. It was locked, as Waverley had said. A heavy iron gate in the courtyard's outer wall, fitted with a modern lever mechanism, and, when Holmes examined it closely, with fresh scratches around the lock plate that were entirely inconsistent with the age and condition of the surrounding metalwork. Holmes straightened. Behind me, Waverley drew a slow breath. "It has been picked," he said, quietly enough that only we heard him. "Picked," Holmes agreed, "and recently. Within the last 24 hours. He looked from the gate across the courtyard to the window of the Belgian suite's antechamber, measuring the line between them with his eyes. "Someone entered through this gate. Someone who knew the layout of this building well enough to move through it at night without disturbance, to reach two separate locations, to leave behind them a precisely curated scene." He paused. "Curated," I repeated. "I choose the word deliberately, Watson." He looked at me. "The scene in the east corridor was not left carelessly. It was not the scene of a man who bled there by accident and was removed in haste. The blood is real, your professional assessment was correct, but the scene was arranged after the fact. Someone went to considerable trouble to ensure that we would find what we found, in the order we found it, and to ensure we would ask precisely the questions we have been asking. The courtyard was very quiet around us. The fog had thinned to a pale translucence, and the palace walls rose on every side with their accumulated weight of history and surveillance. "Then who is the blood?" I asked. It was not, I immediately realized, quite the right grammatical construction. Holmes registered the irregularity with the ghost of a smile. "That," he said, "is the correct question. Imperfectly phrased, but correct. And the answer, when we have it, will tell us everything else." He put his lens away in his pocket, buttoned his coat against the morning chill, and looked once more at the gate and its fresh scratches. "Someone is telling us a story," he said quietly. "The question is whether we are the intended audience or merely the instrument." He said nothing further. But I noticed as we turned to go back inside that he paused for just a moment and looked east across the courtyard, across the wall, across the rooftops of London in the direction of the river, with the expression of a man who has just remembered something he had been waiting to remember. That evening, without explanation, he sent a telegram. I did not see its contents. I did not know until much later to whom it was sent. But I noted the address he gave to the boy. It was not Scotland Yard. It is one of the reliable patterns of Scotland Yard, in my experience, that when a case presents itself with sufficient urgency and sufficient visibility, the machinery of official investigation accelerates in inverse proportion to its accuracy. The pressure of public consequence, or, in this instance, of royal consequence, does not sharpen the police mind so much as it narrows it, compressing the field of possibility until the first plausible solution presents itself with the seductive brightness of a lantern in a dark room. Whether that lantern is leading toward the truth or away from it is a question that the urgency of the moment does not encourage one to ask. By the afternoon of the 15th of November, Scotland Yard had found their man. His name was Victor Holst, and he was, by the account of Inspector Waverley, delivered to Holmes and myself over a late luncheon at Baker Street, a person of considerable interest. He was a Swede by birth, 41 years of age, who had lived in London for the previous 9 years and worked, until 3 months prior, as a junior steward at one of the gentlemen's clubs in Pall Mall, a club whose membership, Waverley noted with careful significance, included several individuals with connections to the palace household. He had been dismissed from this position in August following a dispute, the precise nature of which Waverley described as a matter of misappropriated property, though he was careful not to elaborate beyond the minimum required for the narrative. Since his dismissal, Holst had been living in lodgings in Pimlico, a 15-minute walk from the palace, and had been known to make statements witnessed, Waverley assured us, by no fewer than 3 credible parties that were, in the inspector's diplomatic language, intemperate in nature, and directed toward those who had arranged his dismissal. He had been found that morning in his lodgings, having apparently not left them in some days. He was in a state of agitation consistent, in the police surgeon's assessment, with a man under significant strain. His coat hanging behind the door had blood on the left sleeve. "What quantity?" Holmes asked immediately. Waverley had anticipated the question. "Enough to be visible, a smear perhaps 3 inches at the cuff, consistent with the wound that produced the palace stain. The surgeon believes it possible." "Possible!" Holmes said, in the tone he reserved for words whose actual meaning he found inadequate. "The blood type cannot be determined with the methods currently available to us," Waverley continued, with the patience of a man who has dealt with Holmes long enough to know that these interruptions are part of the price of his assistance. "We have his coat, his lodgings are being searched, and he is being held at Bow Street. He has denied everything. He has denied specific things, or denied generally." Waverley paused. "He said, and I am quoting him precisely, Mr. Holmes, as I anticipated you would wish me to, he said, "Precisely, Mr. Holmes, as I anticipated you would wish me to," he said, "I have done nothing to anyone in that building, and anyone who says otherwise is lying or mistaken," which our sergeant interpreted as a general denial. "Your sergeant," Holmes said pleasantly, "interpreted it incorrectly. That is not a general denial. That is a very specific one. He said he has done nothing to anyone in that building. He did not say he has never been in the building. He did not say he has not done something to someone somewhere." He chose his words with considerable care for a man under significant strain. Holmes rose from his chair and went to the mantelpiece. "What do you know of his movements on the night in question?" "His landlady says he was in his room all evening. She heard him moving about. She heard movement. She did not see him. He is 1 floor above her. She has no reason to lie." "I have no doubt she is telling the truth about what she heard," Holmes said. "I merely observe that what she heard and what she believes she heard may be distinct things." He turned. "I should like to speak with Victor Holst. I thought you might," Waverley said, and produced from his coat's inner pocket a document with the preemptive efficiency of a man who has learned, through repeated experience, to bring the thing Holmes will ask for before Holmes asks for it. "I have arranged access." Holmes took the document and held it for a moment without reading it, his eyes distant. "Before we go," he said, "one question. The club from which Holst was dismissed. What was the nature of the misappropriation?" Waverley shifted slightly. "A private document, taken from the secretary's office." "What kind of document?" "A pause. A membership list." Holmes went very still. "A membership list," he said quietly. He set the document on the mantelpiece. "Waverley, I strongly recommend that you do not permit the press any details of this arrest until I have spoken with Holst. Will you give me until tomorrow morning?" Waverley looked uncomfortable but not surprised. "I can hold them until 9 o'clock. After that the Commissioner—" "Tomorrow at 9, Holmes said. "Watson, your coat?" Bow Street Magistrates' Court and its attendant police station occupy a position in London's legal geography that is simultaneously central and austere, a building that has absorbed a great deal of human distress over its lifetime, and which communicates this absorption in the particular quality of its silences. We were admitted through a side entrance by a constable who clearly found the experience of meeting Sherlock Holmes in person both gratifying and mildly terrifying, and was shown to a small interview room whose furnishings were a table, 2 chairs on one side, one on the other, and a window of frosted glass that admitted light without view. Victor Holst was brought in. I had formed a picture of him from Waverley's account, and the man who entered the room aligned with that picture only partially. I had expected resentment, the compressed, specific resentment of a man who has been dismissed from a position he valued, who has nursed his grievance through 3 months of reduced circumstances, who has allowed that grievance to become in his mind a structural injustice rather than a personal reversal. I had not expected what I actually saw, which was fear. He was a lean man of middle height, fair in the Scandinavian manner, with a neat moustache that was the remnant of a more prosperous grooming regime, and eyes that were, at this moment, making rapid and constant assessments of every element of the room. He sat down across from us and folded his hands on the table with the deliberateness of a man imposing control on himself from the outside in. Holmes looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, quite conversationally, "Mr. Holst, I am not a policeman." Holst looked at him carefully. "I know who you are." "Then you know that what I want from you is different from what the police want. The police want a prosecution. I want to understand what actually happened." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "The blood on your coat sleeve. I have explained that. I cut my hand on a broken jar 3 days ago. There is a scar which your surgeon has already seen. The scar is consistent with such an injury," Holmes agreed. "That is not in dispute. What is in dispute is whether the blood on your sleeve came from that cut." He paused. "Mr. Holst, I should tell you that I do not believe you broke into Buckingham Palace and attacked someone in the East Corridor." Holst's jaw tightened. "Then why—" "I do not believe it because the person who staged the scene in that corridor is a highly intelligent individual with specific knowledge and a specific purpose, and the evidence against you is—" Holmes paused, selecting the word with visible care, "convenient. Uncomfortably, almost artistically convenient. The blood on your sleeve, the proximity of your lodgings, your known statements, your possession of the membership list, these things arrange themselves into a picture with a speed and completeness that should alarm any thoughtful investigator." Holmes stared at him. Something shifted in his face, the specific shift of a man hearing articulated, for the first time, the fear he has been unable to name. "Someone has done this to me deliberately," he said. It was not quite a question. "Tell me about the membership list," Holmes said. The silence that followed was of the quality that precedes a decision. Holst looked at the table, then at me, then at Holmes. Whatever he found in Holmes's expression, that steady, non-judgmental attention appeared to resolve the decision for him. "I did not steal it," he said. "I was given it." "By whom?" "A man who came to the club. He was a member, or he presented himself as one. He asked me to make a copy of the list for him. He said it was a personal matter. He gave me £20, and when the copy was discovered missing, only a copy. I am not a fool, Mr. Holmes. I left the original precisely where it was, but the copy was found in my desk and they quote." He stopped. "He must have arranged for it to be found. I realized that later. He used me to obtain the list and then removed me from my position so that I would cease to be a risk to him. £20, and then I am dismissed, and I am living in Pimlico with my savings running dry." Holmes was very still. "The man who gave you the £20, describe him. 60 perhaps. White hair, very precisely kept. He spoke without accent, educated English, professional. He wore a dark suit of excellent quality and a gold watch chain. On the chain was a fob, a small decorative piece. A key, I thought, but fashioned as an ornament rather than a functional object." Holmes and I did not exchange a glance, but I was aware, in the way one becomes aware of things in Holmes's presence, that the description had landed with a weight that exceeded its surface meaning. "One more question," Holmes said. "On the night of the 14th, the night the blood was found at the palace, you were in your room, your landlady heard you. But were you alone?" Another silence. Longer this time. "I was not," Holmes said at last. "There was a man with me. He came at 9 in the evening and left before midnight. He can confirm I was there. His name?" Holst looked at the table. "He will not want to be involved." "He may have no choice," Holmes said, not unkindly. "His name, Mr. Holst. I will be as discreet as the truth permits." "Cartwright," Holst said quietly. "Edmund Cartwright. He is a clerk at the Home Office." Holmes rose. He buttoned his coat and reached for his hat. His face was composed, but his eyes were doing what they do at moments of significant discovery, a brightness that he does not permit to become expression, banked and careful. "Thank you, Mr. Holst," he said. "I recommend you eat something and sleep if you are able. I cannot promise your release, but I can promise that the case against you is considerably weaker than it appears, and that I intend to make it weaker still." We were shown out by the terrified and gratified constable. On the street, in the thin afternoon light, Holmes walked for half a block in silence. "He is being kept here deliberately," I said at last. "As a distraction." "As several things," Holmes said. "As a distraction, yes. As a demonstration that the person behind this is not merely capable of the act itself, but of the management of its consequences, as a warning perhaps to certain parties that he has sufficient knowledge and sufficient reach to construct a convincing case against an innocent man at will. He paused at the curb and raised his hand for a cab. "As a message, Watson." "To whom?" "To whoever it is that fears him most." He looked at me. "Which is not, I think, Scotland Yard, and not in the first instance the Queen's household." The cab arrived. Holmes gave the driver an address that surprised me, not Baker Street, not the Palace, but a building in Whitehall whose function I was not immediately able to place. "Holmes," I said as we moved off. The man Holst described. White hair, gold watch chain, the key fob. "You recognize the description." Holmes looked out of the window. The afternoon fog was returning, softening the city's edges, turning gas lamps into halos along the embankment. "I have encountered the description before," he said carefully, "in a different context, and some years ago, and in documents that were not intended for my eyes, though they found their way to me nonetheless." He turned from the window. "Watson, I need you to do something for me this evening without asking why."
"Of course."
"Go to Baker Street. Speak with Thomas Ketch. Hear what he has to say. Write it down exactly as he says it, every word, every detail, with the precision I know you are capable of when you apply yourself." He paused. "And, Watson, do not share what he tells you with Waverley. Not yet. Not until I say so. You think Ketch's testimony is connected?" "I think Ketch's testimony," Holmes said, with the careful neutrality that I now knew to read as the containing of something considerably larger, "may be the spine of this entire matter. Every other piece of evidence we have encountered, the corridor, the gate, the cuff-link, Holst, the membership list, I believe these are the ribs. Ketch is the spine." The cab slowed as we entered Whitehall. Holmes alighted at the building I had not recognized and mounted its steps with the purposeful stride of a man expected, though he had sent no card that I had seen. He paused at the top step and looked back down at me. "Be careful going home," he said. It was said in the ordinary tone he used for ordinary cautions, but Holmes did not issue ordinary cautions without reason. I looked behind me, and then ahead, and then up at the windows of the surrounding buildings, with the sudden and not entirely comfortable sensation that the street was not as empty as it appeared. I pulled my coat close and walked briskly in the direction of Baker Street, and I did not look behind me again, though I wanted to. There is a particular quality of silence that belongs to Baker Street in the evening hours, when the day's commerce has retreated, and the gas lamps have assumed their sovereignty over the fog, and the sitting-room fire has settled into the steady, democratic warmth that makes it equally hospitable to thought and to conversation. It is a silence that Holmes and I have inhabited together across many hundreds of evenings, and which I have come, over the years, to associate not with emptiness but with potential the hush, before something is said that changes the shape of what one knows. I arrived at Baker Street at 5:30 to find Thomas Ketch where Holmes had left him in the kitchen, at Mrs. Hudson's table, with the remains of a substantial meal before him, and the expression of a man who has been well treated and is deciding how to feel about it. He was not a man who received hospitality without suspicion, I judged. His life, whatever its particulars, had taught him that comfort offered freely generally carries a cost that presents itself later. Mrs. Hudson met me in the hall with the quiet efficiency that was her invariable mode in situations where efficiency was required. "He's been perfectly civil," she said, in the tone she reserved for assessments that were meant to reassure, and did so only partially. "Ate everything I put before him. Hasn't spoken above a dozen words." She paused. "He watches the door, Doctor." "Which door?" "All of them," she said, and returned to her kitchen with the self-possessed air of a woman who has seen enough of Holmes's guests to maintain her equilibrium in the face of the unusual. I went through to Ketch. He looked up when I entered, his assessment of me rapid and unsentimental. He had the docker's habit of reading men quickly, a professional skill developed in an environment where the wrong reading could cost a man his day's work or something considerably more. "Mr. Holmes said I was to speak to you," he said. It was neither welcoming nor hostile, purely factual. "He did," I said, and sat across from him. I produced my notebook and my pen with the directness that I have found, over many years of taking down accounts, is more respectful of a working man's time than the elaborate social prologue that other settings might require. "I want you to tell me exactly what you saw on the Millwall docks 3 nights ago. Every detail in the order you remember it. Don't edit for what seems important, let me be the judge of that. Mr. Holmes will make the final judgment." Ketch looked at my notebook. Then he looked at me again. Whatever he found in my face, the plain, unadorned attentiveness of a medical man accustomed to hearing things that are difficult to say appeared to satisfy him. He put his large hands flat on the table and began. 3 nights prior to our conversation, the 12th of November, a Tuesday, Thomas Ketch had been working a late tide at the Millwall docks, unloading cargo from a Belgian merchant vessel that had come in that afternoon with a consignment of industrial goods, and, more relevantly, a secondary cargo of crated items whose paperwork, Ketch noted with the experienced eye of a man who has handled many cargoes, was not quite in the order it should have been. He had not remarked upon this publicly. On the docks, certain irregularities are observed and not observed in equal measure, and a man who makes it his business to remark upon them tends to find his work drying up in ways that are never explicitly explained. Ketch had worked the Millwall docks for 11 years. He knew the arithmetic of discretion. The cargo in question, 4 wooden crates of moderate size, stenciled in what appeared to be French, but which Ketch, who had some education, recognized as approximating French rather than constituting it, had been separated from the main manifest and loaded onto a private wagon rather than the bonded warehouse. This in itself was not entirely without precedent. What was without precedent in Ketch's experience was the man who came to supervise this transfer. Came down about 11 at night, Ketch said. Private carriage, no livery. 2 men with him, both large, both keeping their hands free. He said this last detail with the matter-of-fact recognition of a man who knows what it means when men keep their hands free. The man himself was not what you'd expect on the docks at that hour. Describe him, I said. Ketch's description, delivered with the plainness of a man who deals in observable fact rather than impression, produced in me an immediate and arresting recognition that I was careful not to show. White hair cut close and precise, a dark coat of the sort that is not purchased from a catalogue, a watch chain of heavy gold, and upon that chain, visible when the lamplight caught it as the man leaned forward to inspect the paperwork on the wagon's tailgate, a small golden fob in the shape of a key, ornamental, not functional, fashioned with a jeweler's precision. The white-haired man with the key fob, the same man that Victor Holst had described, from whose hand he had taken £20 and a membership list, and the ruin of his professional life. I wrote it all down. I kept my face composed and my pen moving, and I said nothing beyond the occasional quiet prompt to continue. The crates, Ketch said, had been loaded onto the wagon by the 2 large men, not by the dock workers, which was irregular and had caused a brief friction that the white-haired man had resolved by the simple expedient of placing a banknote on the wagon's tailgate and looking at the dock foreman until the foreman looked away. The wagon had then departed east, along the road that follows the river curve toward Greenwich. That would have been the end of it, Ketch said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man recounting the moment when ordinariness ceased. Except that one of the crates, the second one, loaded last one of its boards, had worked loose in the handling. Not enough to fall open, but enough that the lamplight caught the gap. He paused. His large hands, still flat on the table, pressed down slightly, as though steadying themselves against what came next. "What did you see through the gap?" I asked. Ketch looked at me steadily. "A hand," he said. "A human hand, at rest, fingers curled. No movement. The sitting-room was very quiet." "You are certain?" I said, not because I doubted him, but because the question was necessary. "I have been unloading cargo for 11 years, he said simply. "I know what is in a crate and what is not. I wrote it down. I wrote every word. And after you saw this, I said nothing. I walked to the far end of the dock, and I was sick over the side into the water, which I have not been since my first week on the job. And then I went home, and I sat with it for 2 days, and I could not decide what to do, because on the docks you do not go to the police with what you see, or you do not work on the docks any longer, and I have a wife and 2 children. He met my eyes. "And then Mr. Holmes found me, and he is not the police, and he looked at me in a way that I did not think I could lie to. So here I am." I closed my notebook. "You did the right thing, Mr. Ketch," I said. "Whatever comes of this." He nodded once, without the particular comfort that the statement was designed to offer. Holmes returned to Baker Street at 8:15 that evening. He entered the sitting-room without removing his coat, which told me he had been moving fast and was still moving fast in his mind. He looked at me and then at my notebook on the table, and he sat and took it up without asking permission. He never asks permission for things he considers necessary, and read it through with the speed of a man whose eye can extract meaning from a page the way other men extract it from long consideration. When he finished, he set the notebook down and sat for a long moment with his eyes closed and his hands pressed together. "A hand in a crate," I said, because the silence had reached a point where filling it seemed necessary. "A body in a crate," Holmes said, without opening his eyes. "Or a living person rendered insensible. The distinction matters enormously and is not yet determinable from what Ketch has told us." He opened his eyes. "The Belgian merchant vessel. I shall need its name and its port of registration." Ketch gave me both. I found the page. The vessel is the Rhine Marguerite, registered in Antwerp. It departed London this morning on the returning tide. Holmes was on his feet. He went to the shelf of reference volumes he kept along the east wall, pulled down a maritime register, and found the entry in under a minute. He read it, replaced the volume, and stood with his back to me, looking at the books as though seeing through them. "Antwerp," he said to himself rather than to me. "Holmes, what did you learn in Whitehall?" He turned. His face had the look it wore when he had assembled a significant portion of a picture, and was aware that the portion he had assembled was alarming. "I spoke with a man I trust," he said carefully, "in a department whose name I will not give you, because the giving of it would tell you things that are not mine to tell." He confirmed the identity of the man Holst, described the man Ketch has now independently confirmed, which matters greatly, as it removes any possibility that we are dealing with a coincidence of description. "You know who he is." "I know what he is," Holmes said with a precision that was itself a kind of evasion. "His name is for the purposes of this conversation, and I mean that qualification seriously, Watson. His name is immaterial. What is material is that he occupies a position that is not official but which carries a weight of influence upon certain official matters that exceeds what most people in this city could compass. He is a man who moves in the space between governments and their instruments, between what states require and what they are willing to publicly admit to requiring. I absorbed this. A spy, I said. That word, accurate as it is in some respects, is insufficient in others. A man of his type operates on a scale for which spy is a diminution. Holmes came back to his chair and sat, but did not settle. He occupied it with the coiled energy of a man who is restraining movement. The membership list that Holst was used to obtain, it is a list of a particular club's members. That club is not remarkable on its face. It is, however, the meeting ground of a very specific network of men whose positions span 3 governments and 2 major financial institutions. The list itself is in the hands of someone who knows how to read it, a map of influence and obligation that would be of extraordinary value to a foreign intelligence service. "And the crates from the Rhine Marguerite," I said slowly. "A Belgian vessel. Antwerp as port of registration." "Antwerp is not, in this context, merely a city," Holmes said. "It is a thoroughfare, a point of transfer between one world and another." He stopped. He was looking at the fire, and his expression had closed in the way it does when he has reached the boundary of what he is willing to share. I know that expression. I have argued with it, pressed against it, attempted to circumnavigate it across many years of partnership. I know that arguing with it is futile and that circumnavigating it is impossible. Holmes withholds information in the way a careful surgeon withholds a diagnosis until the evidence is sufficient to support it, not from secrecy for its own sake, but from a rigorous aversion to the premature conclusion. But there was something else in his face that evening, something I had not often seen. I searched for the word across the days that followed before I found it. It was not quite caution. It was something closer to protectiveness. "Holmes," I said, "is there something you are not telling me because you believe I should not know it, or because you believe it is safer for me not to?" He looked at me across the fire. "At this particular moment," he said quietly, "those 2 things are the same." I had no answer for that. I sat with it in the way one sits with truths that are complete but not comfortable, and the fire settled in the grate, and somewhere in the kitchen Mrs. Hudson was speaking to Thomas Ketch in the easy, practical way she spoke to everyone who sat at her table, and the Baker Street traffic moved in its ordinary patterns below the window, and none of it not the warmth, not the domesticity, not the ordinary sounds of an ordinary London evening quite dispelled the feeling that had settled over me since Holmes's return. We were moving towards something. Holmes knew what it was, and he had decided, for reasons he considered sufficient, that I should walk toward it without knowing its name. I turned in early that evening. I did not sleep well. In the morning I found a note on the breakfast table in Holmes's hand. 3 lines only, written with the compressed urgency of a man who had been awake while I slept. The cufflink bears the initials R.V. The engraving is of Belgian workmanship. Do not mention this to Waverley. I am gone to verify one further thing, and will return by noon. Lock the door. I read it twice. Then I locked the door. Holmes did not return by noon. I sat with that fact through the morning hours in the way one sits with a fact that has not yet declared whether it is ordinary or significant. Baker Street went about its business below the window. Mrs. Hudson moved through the flat with the quiet purposefulness that was her invariable mode in Holmes's absence, and Thomas Ketch remained in the kitchen, eating toast and reading an old copy of the Illustrated London News with the patient self-containment of a man accustomed to waiting without knowing what he is waiting for. At 10:30 I wrote up my notes from Ketch's account in fair copy, adding my own observations of the man's manner and credibility, which I judged to be considerable. At 11 I read the note again. The cufflink bears the initials R.V. The engraving is of Belgian workmanship. R.V. I turned the letters over in my mind, searching my not inconsiderable store of recent European political memory for a figure to whom they might attach. The Belgian connection had been deepening with each revelation, the merchant vessel, the crates. Now the cufflink itself, and I was aware that this deepening was either the natural convergence of genuine evidence or a constructed trail, carefully laid, pointing us in a direction that served someone's purposes rather than the truth. Holmes had not yet told me which. At noon he had not returned. At 12:15 the first thing happened. It was not dramatic in its presentation. The most significant events I have found rarely are. What arrived was simply a boy, the kind of street boy that London produces in great numbers, sharp-faced and quick-footed, with the self-possession of a child who has learned to deliver messages without reading them, and to vanish immediately after. He knocked, handed Mrs. Hudson a folded paper with my name on it, and was gone before she had finished accepting it. The paper contained 4 words in a hand I did not recognize. Ketch must leave now. No signature, no address, no further elaboration. I read it twice and then went immediately to the kitchen. "Mr. Ketch," I said, with the controlled directness that Holmes has, over the years transferred to me by the osmosis of proximity, "I need you to leave Baker Street immediately, not through the front door." Mrs. Hudson. "The area steps," she said from behind me, with the calm of a woman who has arranged such departures before. "Into the alley, left toward Paddington." Ketch was on his feet before I finished speaking. Whatever else the man was, he was not slow. He looked at me once, with the flat, assessing expression I had come to recognize, and then at the note in my hand, and he picked up his cap from the table. "Am I being followed?" he asked. "Purely practical. No panic in it." "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I won't risk you to find out. Where do I go?" I made a decision in the space of 2 seconds. "Do you know the Anchor public house on Bankside?" "I know it." "Go there. A table near the back. Order something, eat, don't leave. If Holmes does not come or send word by this evening—" I stopped, because the contingency beyond that point was one I was not yet prepared to name. "He will come," I said instead, with a confidence I did not entirely possess. "Or he will send me." Ketch nodded, put on his cap, and followed Mrs. Hudson to the area steps. I heard the door open and close, and then the house was quiet in the particular way of a place from which something important has recently departed. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the remains of Ketch's toast. Then I put the note in my pocket and went back to the sitting-room window to watch the street. Holmes returned at 1:20. He came in the front door, which told me he was not being followed or did not believe he was. He came upstairs at his ordinary pace, not the rapid ascent of a man with urgent news, but not the deliberate slowness of a man who is tired or defeated either. He entered the sitting-room, saw me at the window, and saw something in my expression before I had spoken a word. "Ketch is gone," he said. "I sent him." I handed him the note. He read it, and he did something I had rarely seen him do in the face of external events. He went still, not the stillness of thought, but the stillness of a man absorbing a physical blow. Brief, perhaps 2 seconds, and then it was gone. But I had seen it. "Good," he said. "You acted correctly." He put the note in his pocket. "Where?" "The Anchor on Bankside. Something moved across his face. "Of all the places in London, Watson, you chose a public house 40 yards from where Ketch's information becomes most dangerous." He said it without censure analytically, as he says most things, but I felt the implication of it nonetheless. "I didn't know the geography was significant," I said. "You couldn't have known." He moved to the mantelpiece and stood with his back to the fire, and I saw then what the morning had done to him. He was not physically diminished. Holmes in his working state is not a man who diminishes easily, but there was a quality of compression about him, as though the last several hours had compacted something in him further inward, behind the professional surface where I could not follow it. "What did you find this morning?" I asked. "Confirmation of several things I suspected, and one thing I did not." He paused. "The Rhynie Marguerite carried a secondary manifest that was not declared to the London Customs Authority. I obtained this information through a channel I will not specify, from a man who owed me a service of some years' standing. The secondary manifest listed, among other items, medical supplies for a private clinic in Antwerp. The clinic exists. I verified it. It is operated by a physician named Dr. F. Vandermeer, who has no criminal record and an entirely respectable practice, which is precisely the kind of respectability that, in my experience, is most useful to the kind of enterprise we are examining. "And R.V.," I said. Holmes looked at me. "You have been thinking about the initials all morning." "And?" "Nothing conclusive. Belgian workmanship on the cufflink. A Belgian vessel. A clinic in Antwerp. R.V. I thought of Flemish surnames. Van something. Vandermeer himself, though that gives us V.F. or F.V., depending on convention." I paused. "Or a given name beginning with R." "Raoul," Holmes said quietly. "Raoul Vandermeer. The physician's son, 28 years old, educated in Brussels and Paris. Employed until 8 months ago as a private secretary to a senior member of the Belgian diplomatic mission in London." The sitting room was very quiet. "The Belgian diplomatic mission," I said. "The same mission whose personnel were recently accommodated, during the refurbishment of their Belgravia premises, in the Belgian suite at Buckingham Palace." Holmes held my eyes. "A suite whose private antechamber bears a blood-stained door-handle. A suite to which Raoul Vandermeer, as a junior member of the diplomatic household, would have had legitimate access during that period." The pieces arranged themselves in my mind with the cold, mechanical clarity that Holmes's best revelations always produce, not the flash of sudden illumination, but the slow, incremental tightening of a picture that was always there, waiting for sufficient evidence to make it visible. "He left something," I said, "during the diplomatic residence. He left something in that antechamber, a means of access, a hidden key." "Or knowledge," Holmes said. "Something more valuable and less physical than a key. He knew the suite. He knew the layout. He knew the palace's rhythms from the period of residence. And then, 8 months ago, he was removed from his diplomatic position. The circumstances of his removal have been," he paused, "managed. Officially, he resigned for personal reasons. Unofficially, there were questions about certain correspondence that passed through his hands." "The white-haired man," I said. "He recruited Vandermeer, used his diplomatic access." "I believe so, though the question of which man is directing and which is being directed is one I have not yet resolved to my satisfaction." Holmes pushed himself away from the mantelpiece and moved to his chair, but did not sit. "Watson, I need to tell you something that I should perhaps have told you sooner, and I need you to hear it in the spirit in which I intend it, which is not the spirit of drama." I waited. "The man I spoke with yesterday in Whitehall," Holmes said, "the man I described as someone I trust. He told me something during our meeting that I have been considering since. He told me that my interest in this matter had been noted, not by Scotland Yard and not by the palace household." Holmes looked at me directly. "By the white-haired man himself." The implications of this arranged themselves with a speed and clarity I found unwelcome. "He knows you are investigating," I said. "More than that. He knew I was investigating before I had done anything that the conventional instruments of observation could have detected. Which means either that his surveillance is considerably more sophisticated than it should be, or—" Holmes stopped. "Or someone close to the investigation is informing him," I said. "Yes." We looked at each other across the sitting room. The fire. The familiar clutter of Holmes's working life, the papers, the chemical apparatus, the index scrapbooks, the ordinary security of a room we both knew well, which in the space of a sentence had become fractionally less secure. "Not Waverley," I said. "I would not believe it of him." "Nor I," Holmes agreed. "And not Fenwick, who is too frightened to be calculating." But the circle of those with knowledge of this case has widened in the last 24 hours in ways I did not entirely control. And someone within that widened circle is communicating outward. What do we do?" Holmes said nothing for a moment. "Then we give them something to communicate." It was at 3:30 that the second incident occurred. I had gone out briefly to my former practice on Queen Anne Street, where a colleague had asked me to cover a consultation for a patient I knew. It was a brief and routine visit, and I made it without event, and I was returning along Welbeck Street in the thin, grey mid-afternoon when I became aware, in the way that a man who has walked into danger before becomes aware of its preliminary signs, that I was being followed. It was a man in a grey coat on the opposite pavement, perhaps 30 yards behind me. I would not have noticed him at all, except that he had been on the opposite pavement 30 yards behind me when I left Queen Anne Street, and in the interval between there and the corner of Welbeck he had maintained precisely that distance with a consistency that was beyond coincidence. I did not quicken my pace. I have spent enough time at Holmes's side to know that the response that feels correct rapid movement, a sudden turn, is generally the response that confirms one's awareness to the party in question, and thus removes one's only advantage, which is the possibility that they do not know they have been seen. I turned into the next side street, walked 30 yards, and stopped to look in a shop window. The window was a haberdasher's, and in its glass I watched the corner behind me, and in 30 seconds the grey coat appeared at the corner, paused, and then, when I remained stationary, withdrew. I walked on. He did not follow into the side street, which was either caution or confusion. I took a longer route back to Baker Street, passing through 3 additional turns, and arrived satisfied that I had lost him, though shaken in a way that surprised me, as I am not generally a man who shakes easily. Holmes listened to my account without interrupting. When I finished he was quiet for a moment. "Description," he said. "Medium height. Grey coat, good quality." He kept his face away from me deliberately, I think. "Dark hat, brim down. I couldn't give you the color of his eyes at 30 yards in that light. Did he move like a professional?" I thought about it. He was good enough that I almost didn't notice him. Not quite good enough that I didn't. I paused. He was very young, I think. Something in the way he moved at the corner, a fraction of seconds hesitation before he withdrew. A more experienced man would not have hesitated. Holmes nodded slowly. "Young," he said to himself. "Young and not quite seasoned." He stood and went to the window, and looked down at Baker Street with the expression of a man reading a landscape rather than observing it. "They are tightening," he said, "which means either that we are close to something they wish to protect, or that they intend to move before we can prevent it." "Move how?" Holmes did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had the careful, level quality it takes on when what he is saying is designed to be heard without producing the alarm that its content might otherwise justify. "The hand that Ketch saw in the crate," he said. "I have been considering the possible identity of the person it belonged to, and I have arrived at a conclusion that I have been reluctant to share because it requires one further piece of verification." He turned from the window. "Watson, I believe the person transported in that crate, whether alive or dead, is connected to the Belgian diplomatic mission. Not a member of it, not a functionary within it. Someone of considerably greater significance, whose absence from London has not been publicly noted because the parties responsible for noting it have chosen not to." "Holmes," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw in his face the compound of calculation and reluctance that I had identified 2 evenings ago as protectiveness. "Not yet," he said. "One more day. I need one more day, and I need Ketch safe at the anchor, and I need you to send a telegram to a man in Harwich who owes me a very significant favor." He moved to his desk and wrote quickly on a telegraph form, folded it, and handed it to me. "Don't read it until you're outside," he said. "Holmes, I am not keeping things from you for the pleasure of it," he said, with a directness that was itself a kind of rare candor. "I am keeping things from you because we are being watched, and because the fewer things you know with certainty, the fewer things they can learn from watching you." He paused. "I am sorry for it, Watson. I mean that without qualification." I took the telegraph form. I put on my coat. I went back out into the London evening with the grey light failing and the gas lamps coming on one by one along Baker Street, and the particular quality of the fog that sits over the city in November, not obscuring the world but softening it, making everything simultaneously present and uncertain. I did not read the telegram until I was a full street away. When I did, I stood still for a moment. until I was a full street away. When I did, I stood still for a moment on the pavement in the fog with the evening moving around me. Then I walked quickly to the telegraph office and sent it. What it said I will relate in its proper place. For now it is sufficient to say that it was addressed to a name I recognized from Holmes's files, a name connected to the coast, to the movement of vessels, and to the quiet, unglamorous work of watching things arrive and depart from the edges of England. Behind me I was reasonably certain no one followed, but the evening felt very large around me, and Baker Street, when I returned to it, seemed for the first time in many years to offer less than its customary reassurance. There are periods in every investigation of consequence when the ground shifts beneath one's feet so gradually that one does not notice the shifting until the view from one's current position is entirely different from the view one had when one started walking. The 17th of November presented itself as such a period, a day of accumulating motion and diminishing clarity, in which each new development seemed to illuminate the path ahead, only to reveal, upon closer examination, that what it had actually illuminated was a door leading somewhere quite different from where one had expected to go. It began with Waverley. He arrived at Baker Street at 8 in the morning with the purposeful bearing of a man who has slept better than he deserves, and who carries news he considers good. I received him in Holmes's absence. Holmes had risen before dawn without explanation and departed before I came downstairs, leaving only his cold coffee-cup and a quantity of tobacco ash as evidence of how long he had been sitting before he left. I showed Waverley to the sitting-room and gave him coffee from the fresh pot, and listened with the attentiveness I have learned to apply to the accounts of men who believe they are delivering solutions. The case against Victor Holst, Waverley told me, had strengthened considerably overnight. A witness had come forward, a woman, a lodging-house keeper named Mrs. Dolores Petch, whose establishment on Wilton Road stood 3 streets from the palace's south gate. She stated that on the evening of the 14th, she had seen a man answering Holst's description in the vicinity of the south gate at approximately 10:30 in the evening, an hour and a half before the blood was discovered. She was, Waverley assured me, entirely credible. A widow of middle age, long established at her address, with no connection to Holst or to anyone associated with him that the police had been able to determine. Furthermore, Holst's lodgings search had produced, behind a loose board in the bedroom wainscoting, a small quantity of cash in an amount inconsistent with his known income since his dismissal, and a single folded paper bearing what appeared to be a rough diagram of the palace's ground floor, incomplete, obviously drawn from memory rather than any official plan, but unmistakable in its subject. "The Commissioner is satisfied," Waverley said, with the careful tone of a man reporting another man's satisfaction in a matter where his own is not quite complete. "We shall charge Holst this afternoon unless—" He paused. "Unless you or Mr. Holmes have material that bears on the question." I looked at him. I thought of Ketch at the Anchor on Bankside. I thought of the telegram to Harwich. I thought of Holmes's injunction regarding Waverley, delivered with enough precision that I could not misremember it. "Do not share what he tells you with Waverley. Not yet. Not until I say so." "Where is Holmes?" Waverley asked, reading my expression with the accuracy of a man who has spent considerable time reading people's expressions in interview rooms. "Out," I said. Waverley set down his coffee-cup. "Doctor, I am going to speak to you plainly. As a man who has a great deal of professional respect for Mr. Holmes, and who is at the same time answerable to a commissioner, a Home Secretary, and, at one remove, to the palace household. The case against Holst is sufficient. It may not be the case that Mr. Holmes would construct, but it is a case that will stand in court, and the pressure to resolve this matter before Her Majesty's return is substantial." "I understand that," I said. "Then I need to know whether you or Holmes possess information that would materially alter the question of Holst's guilt." He held my eyes. "Because if you do, and Holst is charged without that information being considered, and it subsequently emerges—" "Give me until this evening," I said. Waverley looked at me for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat. 6 o'clock, he said. "Mr. Holmes, or yourself with whatever you have. After 6, the Commissioner's timetable takes precedence." He left. I stood at the window and watched him walk down Baker Street, and I felt the particular discomfort of a man who is withholding something from a person acting in good faith, a discomfort that Holmes, for all his intellectual gifts, has always seemed to carry more lightly than I find possible. Holmes appeared at 11:30. He was in a state of transformation that I recognized immediately, and which, even after long acquaintance, still carried an element of the uncanny. He had been out in his working clothes, the old coat, the worn collar, and he had been, by the evidence of his appearance, somewhere that involved considerable physical exertion in an indoor environment of dust and poor ventilation. His shoes showed a specific pale clay that I did not associate with London's streets, and his left cuff was marked with something dark and slightly resinous that I could not immediately identify. He was nevertheless in excellent spirits. This was itself a signal. Holmes's good spirits in the middle of a dangerous investigation are not the product of comfort but of progress. He came upstairs at speed and went directly to the chemical bench, where he began doing something with a series of small glass vials that I had learned, over time, to observe from a respectful distance. "Waverley has a witness," I said. "Mrs. Dolores Petch of Wilton Road," Holmes said, without turning. "I know about Mrs. Petch." I stared at the back of his head. "How?" "Because I have spent the last 3 hours establishing that Mrs. Petch's testimony, while not precisely false, is the product of a memory that has been assisted. She did see a man near the south gate on the evening in question. That man was not Victor Host. He held one of the vials up to the light and examined its contents with evident satisfaction. She was shown a photograph, Watson, a photograph that was brought to her yesterday morning by a man she describes as a police officer, medium height, grey coat, dark hat, the grey coat, the young man on Welbeck Street." "He isn't police," I said. "He is not." Holmes set down the vial. "He is, I believe, an individual in the employ of the white-haired man, a junior functionary tasked with managing the peripheral details of what is becoming a considerably more complex operation than its architects originally designed. Witnesses prompted, evidence planted, a convenient suspect maintained in police custody. These are the maintenance tasks of a scheme that is running under pressure." "Running under pressure from what?" Holmes turned then, and looked at me with a directness that he reserves for moments when he has decided to give me more than he has previously given. "From us," he said simply. "We are moving faster than they expected. They anticipated a Scotland Yard investigation, competent and methodical, which would reach its conclusions on a predictable schedule and along predictable lines. They did not anticipate," he gestured at the space between us, with a brevity that somehow encompassed everything, "this." I found this simultaneously gratifying and alarming in equal measure. "The floor plan found in Host's wainscoting," I said, "placed there within the last 48 hours. The paper is fresh. The fold lines have not had time to settle into the grain the way paper folds do when they have been maintained for any period. I would not expect a police search to note this, but you may verify it yourself when the evidence is produced at trial, if it reaches trial." He moved to his chair. "Sit down, Watson. I need to tell you several things quickly, and then I need you to do something that will require you to trust me without full explanation, which I recognize is an imposition I have been making rather freely in recent days." "The hand in the crate," he said. "I have now, through the Harwich contact, confirmed that the Rhynie Marguerite made an unscheduled stop at Gravesend before proceeding to open water. At Gravesend a private tender came alongside. The tender was registered to a company that does not appear in any trade directory, but whose registered address is a solicitor's office in Gray's Inn, whose principal client I have spent 2 days identifying." He paused. "That client is a man known in certain European circles as a financial intermediary of remarkable discretion and equally remarkable moral flexibility. His name is August Renner. He is Austrian by birth, Swiss by current residence, and he has, until approximately 4 months ago, maintained a working relationship with a senior member of the Belgian diplomatic community in London." "The white-haired man," I said. "The white-haired man's superior," Holmes said, with the quiet emphasis of someone correcting a calculation that was close but not precise. "The white-haired man whose name, Watson, I will now give you, because the time for withholding it has passed, is a man called Cornelius Hale. He is 63 years old, a British subject, and he has worked for the past 20 years as what the official record would describe as a consultant to various government departments, and what the unofficial record, the record that does not exist, which I have none the less read, would describe as a broker of intelligence. He sells what he knows, and what he knows is extensive, because he has spent 2 decades ensuring that the people who know things are also people who owe him favors." "And Hale obtained the membership list through Holst," I said, and he moved Raoul Vandermeer through the docks in a crate aboard a Belgian vessel. He moved someone through the docks, Holmes corrected carefully. I am not yet certain. Someone through the docks, Holmes corrected carefully. I am not yet certain that the person in the crate was Vandermeer. What I am certain of is that the cufflink bearing Vandermeer's initials was placed in that corridor deliberately either by Vandermeer himself as a signal or by someone else to direct us toward him. I absorbed this. If it was a signal, then Vandermeer may be alive and in the crate willingly, and the entire palace scene was his creation, a message sent to someone who would know how to read it. Holmes pressed his fingertips together. Or the cufflink was placed by Hale to give us a name to pursue, while the true identity of the person in the crate remains concealed. Two entirely different cases, I said slowly. Occupying the same physical evidence, Holmes agreed, which is what makes this particular construction so elegant and so dangerous. He rose suddenly. Watson, I need you to go to Bow Street this afternoon. Not to see Holst. I have already seen Holst this morning, which is in part why I am late. I need you to speak with Edmund Cartwright. Holst's alibi, I said. The Home Office clerk? The Home Office clerk, who has not, it appears, come forward voluntarily to confirm Holst's alibi, despite having been with him on the night in question. I need to know why. Holmes handed me a card with an address, not Bow Street itself, but a private address in Pimlico, near to Holst's lodgings. He is not at his office today. He has taken a sudden indisposition. I find sudden indispositions in potential witnesses to be among the most diagnostic symptoms I encounter. What am I to say to him? Tell him, Holmes said, that Victor Holst will be charged with a serious crime this evening unless he comes forward before 6 o'clock. Tell him nothing else. Watch his face when you say it and report to me everything you see there. Edmund Cartwright occupied rooms on the second floor of a respectable terraced house in Pimlico, whose landlady admitted me with the faint suspicion of a woman who has been receiving unscheduled visitors since the morning. Cartwright himself met me at his sitting-room door in a dressing-gown at 2 in the afternoon, which confirmed the indisposition if not its nature. He was perhaps 30, slight and fair, with the meticulous presentation of a man whose professional environment rewards precision, and whose personal circumstances were, at this moment, not reflecting it. He had the red-rimmed eyes and the careful stillness of someone who has not slept much, and has been managing fear for long enough that managing it has become its own kind of exhaustion. He knew who I was before I stated my name, which told me he had been expecting some version of this visit. I gave him Holmes's message. I kept my eyes on his face as Holmes had instructed, and I watched what happened there. What happened was not guilt and not defiance. What happened was relief, a brief, intense, involuntary relief that passed across his features like light through a gap in cloud cover before he suppressed it. Relief at the prospect of speaking. Relief that the silence he had been maintaining was about to have a reason to end. I will come, he said quietly. Tell Mr. Holmes I will come at 5. May I ask why you haven't come sooner? I said. Holst has been held since yesterday. Cartwright looked at me. He pulled his dressing-gown more closely around him, and I noticed for the first time the marks on his wrists, not injuries, but the kind of marks left by cord or rope when it has been applied for a period. Old enough to be fading, recent enough to still be visible. Because, he said, with a precision that told me the answer had been prepared and was given exactly as he intended to give it. I was told that if I spoke to the police, or to Mr. Holmes, or to anyone at all, what had happened to the man in the crate would happen to me. I left Pimlico with considerable speed and returned to Baker Street in the kind of mental state that I generally associate with the middle stages of a Holmes investigation, the stage at which the picture has become clear enough to be alarming, and not yet clear enough to suggest a solution. Holmes heard my account of Cartwright's wrists and his words and his imminent arrival without visible expression, though his eyes told a different story, bright, sharp, absolutely concentrated. "Good," was all he said. Then, "Watson, after Cartwright leaves this evening I shall be going out. I will be gone for some time, possibly overnight." "Where?" He looked at me with the particular expression that means the answer is one he has decided to withhold, not for lack of trust, but for reasons that are, in his judgment, larger than trust. "If I am not back by tomorrow morning," he said, "go to the address in this envelope." He placed a sealed envelope on the mantelpiece. "Not to Waverley, not to Scotland Yard. To that address, and to no one else?" I looked at the envelope. I looked at him. "Holmes," I said, "There is a man," he said quietly, "in a building in Antwerp who is at this moment waiting to discover whether Cornelius Hale has succeeded. When he discovers that Hale has no hand, he will discover it, because I intend to ensure he does. His response will determine whether this matter ends here in London, or extends into something considerably larger." He paused. "I am going tonight to make certain it ends here." He said nothing further on the subject. At 5 o'clock Edmund Cartwright arrived at Baker Street and told Holmes everything he knew. By 6, Holmes had sent his own message to Waverley. By 7, Victor Holst was released from Bow Street, and by 8 o'clock that evening Baker Street was empty of Holmes, and I sat alone by the fire with the sealed envelope on the mantelpiece and the full particular silence of a man waiting for morning. Morning came to Baker Street with the grey, unhurried indifference that November mornings in London reserve for occasions when one most requires urgency. I had slept in the armchair by the fire not from any romantic intention, but from the simpler fact that sleep, when it finally came, found me there, and I had not the energy to dispute its timing. The fire had burned itself to ash by 3 in the morning, and I had woken cold and stiff at 5 and rebuilt it with the automatic movements of a man performing a familiar task while his mind is somewhere else entirely. Holmes had not returned. I knew it before I looked at his bedroom door, which stood open as he always left it when the room was unoccupied. I knew it from the quality of the flat's silence, which was of a different character from the silence of Holmes sleeping, or Holmes thinking, or Holmes performing one of his chemical experiments at an unreasonable hour. It was the silence of absence, definitive, particular, unmistakable to anyone who had lived alongside another person long enough to know the difference. Mrs. Hudson brought breakfast at 7 and said nothing, which told me she had noted the absence and was managing her concern with the same disciplined practicality she brought to everything. She poured my tea and straightened the papers on the side table and looked once at the mantelpiece, where the sealed envelope sat precisely where Holmes had placed it, and she left without a word, which was itself a form of communication between people who have shared a household through a sufficient number of crises. I ate without appetite. I drank 2 cups of tea. I read the morning paper without absorbing more than 1 sentence in 6. And at 8 o'clock, when Holmes had been absent for 12 hours and the envelope had been sitting on the mantelpiece for 12 hours, and the morning had arrived with its full, implacable weight of elapsed time, I took the envelope down and opened it. Holmes's handwriting in moments of deliberate communication, as opposed to his handwriting in the heat of notation, which is rapid and compressed, and requires a kind of interpretive sympathy developed only through long exposure, is a model of lucid precision. He writes as he speaks when he has decided to speak fully, without ornamentation, without the rhetorical scaffolding that lesser minds use to support their meaning, each sentence doing exactly the work required, and no more. The letter was 2 pages. I will not reproduce it in its entirety, partly because portions of it contain details that remain, even at the remove of years, sensitive to parties who are still living, and partly because the emotional effect of reading it alone, in the Baker Street sitting-room, with the fire and the fog and the absence pressing in from all directions, is not something I can reconstruct on the page without diminishing what it actually was. The essential substance was this: Holmes had identified, through a combination of the Harwich contact's intelligence and information obtained during his visit to Whitehall, the probable location of the person transported in the crate aboard the Reine Marguerite. That person, he now believed with sufficient confidence to act upon, was not Raoul Vandermeer. Vandermeer was a peripheral figure used, as Holst had been used, to establish a layer of apparent culpability that would absorb investigation while the actual operation proceeded beneath it. The person in the crate was a Belgian diplomat of senior standing whose name Holmes gave in full in the letter, and which I will here reduce to an initial M.D., both for the reasons of sensitivity I have already described, and because the full name, published, would still today disturb the families of those involved in ways that serve no investigative purpose. M.D. had been, until his disappearance from London 3 weeks prior, the second secretary of the Belgian mission, the man directly above Raoul Vandermeer in the mission's hierarchy, and a man who had been, in Holmes's assessment, on the verge of communicating something of significant diplomatic sensitivity to the British Foreign Office. What he had been about to communicate, Holmes had written, was evidence that Cornelius Hale, the white-haired man, The intelligence broker had been operating a systematic program of document acquisition from within the Belgian mission, using junior personnel as unwitting instruments. Hale had obtained membership lists, correspondence, diplomatic cables, and at least one document whose nature Holmes described only as of the category that governments do not discuss and foreign offices do not acknowledge. He had been selling this material to whom precisely Holmes had not yet established, though he named 2 probable buyers whose nationalities I will decline to specify for a period of not less than 4 years. MD had discovered this. He had assembled evidence. He had been preparing to take that evidence to the Foreign Office through a private channel when he had vanished. The crate on the Rainer Marguerite had been the method of his removal. Whether he was alive or dead when the crate was loaded onto the tender at Gravesend, Holmes did not know. What Holmes did know, and this was the portion of the letter that made me set it down on my knee, for a moment and look at the fire before continuing, was where M.D. had most likely been taken. Not to Antwerp, not to the clinic in Antwerp, which was a receiving point only, to a private property on the Kent coast between Folkestone and Hythe, owned by a company that resolved, through 4 layers of corporate registration, to August Renner's financial network. Holmes had gone to Kent, alone at night, to a property on a coast whose particular geography, the flat marshland, the isolated farmhouses, the shingle beaches that absorb sound and give nothing back, he had described in the letter with the economical precision of a man who has studied a map thoroughly and is translating it into operational terms. He had gone because he believed that M.D. was still alive, a belief grounded in the logic that a dead man is evidence and a living man is leverage, and that Hale, whatever else he was a broker by profession and instinct, and would keep his leverage alive for as long as it served him. He had gone alone because he could not take Waverley without revealing everything to the official machinery, which would alert Hale before Holmes could reach the property, because he could not take me without removing me from Baker Street, which was the node through which all the other threads of the investigation ran, and because, as he wrote in the letter's final paragraph, with a directness that was the closest he ever came in written communication to personal declaration, I have sent you into enough danger in the course of this matter, and I will not send you into this kind before I have established whether the ground is stable enough to stand on. If it is, I will send for you. If I have not sent for you by 9 in the morning, the matter has resolved in one of 2 ways. Either I have succeeded and am engaged in managing the aftermath, or I have not. In the latter case, the address at the foot of this page is that of my brother Mycroft's private office, and Mycroft will know what to do, as Mycroft always knows what to do, though he prefers to give the impression that knowing things requires more effort than it actually does. Mycroft Holmes, the elder brother, that vast and sedentary intelligence who occupied a position in the British governmental machinery so particular and so unspecified that Holmes had once described it to me as being the government, in the sense that the skeleton is the body. I had met Mycroft on 2 occasions, and found him simultaneously the most impressive and the most unsettling man of my acquaintance. After his brother, the same gifts, differently applied, the same absolute confidence in his own conclusions, but directed outward into the machinery of state, rather than inward to the individual case. If Holmes had not returned or sent word by 9 o'clock, I was to go to Mycroft. It was 8:23. I spent the next 37 minutes in a state that I can describe only as disciplined tension, the state a man enters when he is determined not to panic, and is applying that determination actively rather than passively. I checked my revolver, which I had brought from my bedroom at some point during the night, without quite registering the decision. I wrote a brief account of everything I knew, in case anything happened to me before I could deliver it verbally. I made a note of Ketch's location, Cartwright's address, Waverley's name and station. At 9:03 a telegram arrived. It was from Holmes. It contained 7 words. Come to the address in the letter. I was at the door in my coat before Mrs. Hudson had finished reading it over my shoulder. The address in the letter was not in Kent. This surprised me until I understood why. It was a private hotel in Bloomsbury, a quiet, unremarkable establishment of the kind that caters to visiting academics and commercial travellers whose principal virtues are cleanliness, discretion, and the absence of the kind of curiosity that more fashionable establishments sometimes display toward their guests. The clerk at the desk sent me upstairs with the neutrality of a man performing a function and asking no questions about its purpose, and I knocked at the door of room 14 on the second floor and heard Holmes's voice say, "Come," from within. He was sitting in the room's single armchair. He had not slept. He had changed his clothes. The old working coat was gone, replaced by something darker and less remarkable, and there were marks on his right hand, at the knuckle of the index finger and along the outer edge of the palm, that I identified with the clinical directness of a medical man as consistent with a blow delivered rather than received upon a hard surface. Across the room, on the narrow bed, a man was lying still. He was perhaps 55, with the lean face and careful grooming. Of a man accustomed to formal professional environments, wearing the remnants of clothing that had been, at some recent point, of excellent quality, but which had subsequently suffered considerable indignity. He was breathing steadily and without distress, and there was color in his face. He appeared to be sleeping the sleep of a man who has been for some time unable to sleep and has finally been given permission. "MD," I said quietly. "He is uninjured," Holmes said from the armchair. "Sedated chemically chloral hydrate, I believe, administered over a period of some days to maintain a compliant state. The dose was recent enough that the effects will not fully clear until this afternoon. I have examined him as thoroughly as I am able without your instruments, and I find nothing that indicates significant physical harm." He paused. "He will need your professional attention when he wakes." I sat on the edge of the bed and made my own assessment, which confirmed Holmes's. Pulse steady. Pupils responsive to the light from the window. Respiration easy. Mild dehydration, some muscle weakness from prolonged immobility, and the disorientation that chloral administration leaves in its wake, but alive and functionally intact. "The property in Kent," I said as I worked. "A farmhouse on Dymchurch Marsh," Holmes said. "3 men present when I arrived, one of whom I have reason to believe was the young man in the grey coat. I did not announce myself." A pause. "The men are no longer at the farmhouse. They are in the custody of a constable from the Romney Marsh station, to whom I delivered them at 4 this morning, along with a written account sufficient to hold them for 48 hours on charges of unlawful imprisonment." I was not specific about the wider context of the case. "And Hyle?" Holmes looked at his hands. "Hale was not at the farmhouse," he said carefully. "Hale was never at the farmhouse. Men of his type are never in the same physical location as the operational details of their work. Hale is in London. He has been in London throughout." He looked up. "And Hale, Watson, does not yet know that I have found Mr. D." The implications of this settled into the room with the weight of things that cannot be taken back once they have been understood. "He will find out," I said. "The 3 men at the farmhouse will say nothing until they have spoken to a solicitor, which will take some hours, and whose instructions from that solicitor will be, I expect, to say nothing at all, and certainly not to Hale, since a man like Hale does not provide legal assistance to the people he employs, and those people know it." Holmes rose from the armchair with some effort. He was more tired than he was permitting himself to show. "I have perhaps a day, possibly less. In that time I must arrange for MD to give his account to the right person, not Waverley, not the regular police channels, and I must arrange for Hale to be in a position from which he cannot simply disappear into the European network that has sheltered men like him before." He moved to the window and looked out at the Bloomsbury Street below. The fog had lifted somewhat with the morning, and London was visible in its full November grey, going about its business with a magnificent and reassuring indifference to individual crisis that has always seemed to me one of the city's particular forms of comfort. "Holmes," I said, "are you all right?" He was quiet for a moment. "Ask me again tomorrow," he said, "when this is finished." He turned from the window, and whatever he had been briefly inwardly was gone, replaced by the familiar face of the man at work, precise and purposeful and entirely contained. "I need Mycroft," he said, "and I need him today. Will you send the telegram while I sit with our patient? I prefer not to leave him alone." "Of course," I said. I took out my notebook and wrote the telegram as Holmes dictated its 7 words to his brother, at the Diogenes Club, where Mycroft could be reliably found between the hours of 9 and 10 on any morning that did not involve a national emergency, and sometimes on those that did. The telegram said, "It is time. The dining room this afternoon." Holmes read it over, nodded, and handed it back. "The dining room of the Diogenes Club," he said, by way of explanation, "is the only room in that establishment where conversation is permitted. It is also the room in which, twice in my career, things have been arranged that could not be arranged anywhere else." He permitted himself the smallest of smiles. "Mycroft always orders the lamb. The Diogenes Club occupies a position in Pall Mall that is simultaneously prestigious and peculiarly invisible, a building whose exterior gives nothing away to the casual observer, whose windows reveal nothing of what passes within, and whose membership has, over many decades, maintained a collective silence so absolute that the club's existence is widely known and its activities entirely opaque. It was founded, Holmes once told me, for men who had no desire for human society but recognized certain practical advantages in proximity to it, men who wished to read their papers and their dispatches and their correspondence in conditions of perfect quiet, surrounded by others engaged in the same occupation, with the mutual and tacitly agreed understanding that the presence of others was to be treated, at all times, as the absence of others. The dining-room was the single exception. Conversation was permitted there, and it was there that we found Mycroft Holmes at 1:30 in the afternoon, as large and as still and as fundamentally authoritative as I remembered him, seated at the corner table he apparently occupied by long-standing arrangement, with a glass of claret and the remains of what had indeed been the lamb. He looked up when we entered and regarded his younger brother with the particular expression I had seen on his face on both previous occasions, a compound of exasperated affection and the specific satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for a thing to happen and has finally been vindicated in his patience. "Sherlock," he said, "you look dreadful." "I have had a demanding night," Holmes said, taking the chair across from his brother with the deliberate ease of a man refusing to admit how tired he is. "Several demanding nights by the look of it." Mycroft's eyes moved to me with a warmth that was, in its way, as genuine as his brother's was elliptical. "Dr. Watson, you are well?" "Well enough, Mr. Holmes," I said, and sat. Mycroft considered his claret. "I received your telegram at 9:15, he said to Holmes. By 10 o'clock I had confirmed, through channels I will not detail in a setting where even this degree of conversation feels eccentric, that M.D. had been located and was in your care. By 11 I had communicated certain things to certain people, and by noon those people had communicated certain things to certain other people. And the net result," he set down his glass with the precise, unhurried movement of a man for whom precision is a natural state, "is that Cornelius Hale's afternoon is about to become considerably more constrained than he currently anticipates." Holmes leaned forward. "What have you arranged?" "What you asked me to arrange in the subtext of your telegram, which was not subtle, though it was encrypted." Mycroft folded his large hands on the table. "Hale's banking connections in 3 countries have been flagged. The nature of that flagging is such that any attempt to move significant funds will generate a notification that reaches a desk I have access to before it reaches its destination. His travel documents, and he has several under several names, which we have known about for some time without finding sufficient cause to act upon, have been noted at the relevant ports and coastal stations, and a man I trust is currently positioned outside the house in Kensington where Hale keeps his principal London residence." "He has not moved?" Holmes asked. "Not as of an hour ago. He received one visitor this morning, at 9, a man whose description matches what your constable in Romney Marsh communicated through the official channel, which reached my desk by a slightly roundabout route." Mycroft's expression did not change, but something in it acknowledged the bureaucratic logistics of this, with a very slight satisfaction. "The visitor stayed for 12 minutes and left quickly. After that, Hale made 2 telephone calls. The instrument was installed last year. He is more modern in his habits than his appearance suggests, to numbers that trace to a high solicitor's office in the city and a private address in Belgravia that I am currently having identified. He has not left the house. He knows the farmhouse operation has failed," Holmes said. "The visitor this morning was one of the men who should have been at Dymchurch, one who was not present when I arrived, for reasons I could not fully establish. He came to report." Holmes's jaw tightened momentarily. "I was not as thorough as I should have been." "You were thorough enough," Mycroft said, with the mild firmness of an older brother who has made this correction many times and does not intend to make it again. "M.D. is alive and will recover. The 3 men you delivered to Romney Marsh are in custody. The operation is disrupted beyond recovery." He paused. "The question is what Hale will do now." "He has 3 options," Holmes said, and I recognized the cadence he was thinking aloud. which he does rarely and only with people whose intelligence he considers adequate to follow him without prompting. He can run, he can fight, or he can negotiate. Running is foreclosed, as I have described, Mycroft said. Fighting produces a public scandal that destroys the discretion upon which his entire professional value depends. The people who employ him, Renner's network and the intelligence services beyond it, want results obtained quietly. A man who generates a diplomatic incident and a criminal prosecution is of no use to them and of no protection to himself. Which leaves negotiation, I said. Both brothers looked at me, Mycroft with faint surprise, Holmes with something warmer. Which leaves negotiation, Holmes confirmed. And a man who negotiates must come to a table. He must communicate, send representatives, make gestures. He must, in short, move and movement, for a man in Hale's current position requires that he trust someone. Holmes looked at his brother. Has he any reason to trust us? Mycroft permitted himself a smile of a quality I found somewhat difficult to read. He has every reason to fear us, he said, which in a man of his experience is generally sufficient. The trap that Holmes designed in the next 2 hours was, in my considered retrospective judgment, one of the most elegant things he ever constructed, not because it was complex, but because it was the opposite. The most dangerous traps, Holmes has always maintained, are the ones that feel to the person entering them like the safest available option. They do not close from the outside in. They close from the inside out because the person inside has chosen to close them. The mechanism was this. M.D., who had recovered sufficient clarity by early afternoon to confirm his identity and provide a brief, controlled account of what had been done to him, would not go immediately to the Foreign Office. He would instead send, through Mycroft's channels, a private communication to the Belgian diplomatic mission stating that he was alive, in safe hands, and would be presenting his evidence within 48 hours. This communication would be sent in a form that Hale's contacts within the mission, and Holmes was now confident that such contacts existed, would intercept and relay to Hale within hours. Hale would thus know two things: that M.D. had survived, and that he had 48 hours before the evidence reached the people it was intended to reach. What Hale would not know was that the 48 hours was not a window he was being given. It was a window Holmes was looking through, because the only way Hale could prevent M.D.'s evidence from reaching the Foreign Office in 48 hours was to act against M.D. And acting against M.D. meant moving, sending someone, making a communication, visiting a location, and every point of movement had now been mapped and was being watched. "He will not come himself," I said, when Holmes laid this out for me in the cab returning from the Diogenes Club. "A man of his type never places himself at the point of action." "He will not come himself," Holmes agreed. "But he will send someone, and that someone will lead us to him. Not the young operative in the grey coat that line is burned, as Hale will know. He will use a different instrument, someone we have not yet seen, from a direction we have not yet considered, and you know who that will be." Holmes looked out of the cab window at the afternoon streets. "I have a very strong suspicion," he said carefully. "Strong enough to act on, not yet strong enough to name without risking the accusation of prejudging the evidence." This was Holmes in his most precise mode, and I knew better than to press it. That evening Holmes set the second element of his trap. He sent a message to Cornelius Hale directly, not through Mycroft's channels, not through the police, not through any intermediary. A private note, hand-delivered by a street boy to the Kensington address, in Holmes's own handwriting and signed with his full name. I did not see the note before it was sent. I asked Holmes afterward what it contained, and he told me, and I have since considered whether to include it here in its full text. I have decided against it, for reasons I will give at the appropriate moment. What I can say is that it was brief, shorter than Holmes's characteristic written communications, which is itself significant, and that it contained a specific proposition and a specific time and a specific location. The location was Baker Street. The time was 10 o'clock the following morning. Holmes's manner that evening was one I had not seen before in its particular combination. He was still, not the stillness of waiting, which I knew well, but a different stillness, the stillness of a man who has done everything available to him and is now in the interval between preparation and outcome. He ate the supper Mrs. Hudson brought without appearing to taste it. He sat for an hour at his chemical bench without touching anything. He played his violin, not the fierce exploratory playing of the investigative mode, but something slow and deliberate and quite beautiful, which he rarely permitted in company. At 10 o'clock he put the violin away and looked at me across the sitting-room. "Watson," he said, "Whatever happens tomorrow morning, I want you to remain in the room, not in the background at the table, visible, present. Do you understand why?" "You want a witness," I said. "I want something more specific than a witness. I want a man whose judgment Hale will respect and whose presence will confirm to him that what I am offering is genuine and not a further construction." He paused. "Hale has spent 20 years in an environment where everything is a construction, where apparent offer conceals a countermove, every apparent ally conceals a competing interest, every apparent truth conceals a deeper lie. He is, as a consequence, nearly incapable of recognizing sincerity when he encounters it." Holmes looked at me with the directness that I had come to understand, over our years of friendship, as his highest form of compliment. "You, Watson, are the most genuinely sincere man I know. It is not a quality I have always understood or always valued as I should. But tomorrow morning it may be the most useful thing in the room." I did not know what to say to this. I said nothing, which is sometimes the correct response. Holmes went to his bedroom at 11, and I heard nothing further from him that night, which meant he slept or performed sleep with sufficient conviction to generate no evidence to the contrary. I sat with the fire for another hour and thought about sincerity, and traps, and the distance between them, and at midnight I went to bed, and this time I slept properly, with the heavy, dreamless completeness of a man who has finally given the outcome over to the next morning. In the morning I came downstairs at 8 to find Holmes already at the table, dressed and composed, and reading a letter that had arrived in the early post. He looked up when I entered. "He is coming," he said. "How do you know?" Holmes held up the letter. It was a single sheet, folded once, without salutation or signature. The handwriting was small and very controlled, the hand of a man for whom control is not an effort but a habit. It contained 3 words. At 10 o'clock, Holmes set it on the table, poured his coffee, and looked out of the Baker Street window at the November morning. "Now, Watson," he said, with a quiet satisfaction that was the nearest his voice came to something I would call, in another man, relief. "We shall see." He arrived at 3 minutes past 10. I know the precise time because I had been watching the clock on the mantelpiece with particular attention one gives to objects that are marking an interval one cannot otherwise measure, and I had been listening to the street below with the equal attention one gives to sounds when one of those sounds will be significant. The knock, when it came, was neither hurried nor hesitant. It was the knock of a man who has made a decision and is enacting it with the composure he has spent a lifetime cultivating. Mrs. Hudson showed him up. Cornelius. Hale entered the sitting-room of 221B Baker Street with the bearing of a man who has walked into rooms of greater consequence than this one, and conducted himself in them without disadvantage, and who intends to do the same here. He was in person precisely as Holst and Ketch had described him, lean, white-haired, the dark suit of excellent quality, the gold watch-chain visible at the waistcoat. The key fob was there, turning slightly as he moved, catching the morning light from the window. He was 63 years old, and he looked it and did not look it simultaneously, the way certain men of great self-possession carry their age as a credential rather than a diminishment. He looked at Holmes first, then at me, then, with the systematic thoroughness of long professional habit, at the room itself, the exits, the windows, the arrangement of the furniture, the positions of the 2 people present. "Mr. Holmes," he said. His voice was what I would have expected, educated, moderate, carrying no regional trace and no emotional content beyond what he chose to place in it. "Mr. Hale," Holmes said. "Please sit down." Hale sat in the chair nearest the door, a choice that was not, I thought, accidental, and placed his hat on his knee and looked at Holmes with the expression of a man who has prepared for several versions of this conversation and is determining which version this will be. Holmes settled into his own chair with the ease of a man entirely at home, which he was, and regarded Hale with the steady, non-adversarial attention I had seen him direct at dozens of subjects across the years. Not the look of a prosecutor, not the look of a judge, the look of a man who knows a great deal and is arranging it for presentation. "I am going to tell you what I know," Holmes said without preamble. "Not to demonstrate that I know it, that would be a waste of both our time, but because there are elements of the picture that you can confirm or correct, and the accuracy of what follows matters rather more than either of us alone can ensure." He paused. "You may interrupt at any point." Hale said nothing. He waited. Holmes began. 4 years ago," Holmes said, "you established a relationship with a junior member of the Belgian diplomatic mission in London. The junior member was Raoul Vandermeer, son of the physician Dr. F. Vandermeer of Antwerp, a young man of intelligence and ambition whose ambitions had somewhat exceeded the pace at which the diplomatic service was inclined to advance them. You identified this frustration which is your professional gift, identifying the frustrations of people who have something you want, and you offered him a means of converting it into income. The income was modest at first. A piece of correspondence here, a diplomatic cable there, nothing that he would have described to himself as treachery, because each individual transaction was small enough to be rationalized as inconsequential. Hale's expression had not changed. He watched Holmes the way a chess player watches the board. Over time, Holmes continued, the transactions became less inconsequential. Vandermeer had access, by virtue of his position, to the mission's internal correspondence and to the secondary communications that pass between diplomatic posts without appearing on the formal record. He also had access, during the period when the mission staff were accommodated at Buckingham Palace, to the layout and rhythms of the palace's East Wing, information that proved useful to you later, as I shall describe. Holmes reached for his pipe, the old gesture of ratiocination, and turned it in his fingers without lighting it. The membership list obtained through Holst was not, as I initially considered, the primary object of your exercise. It was a supplementary acquisition useful because the club in question serves as an informal meeting point for individuals whose positions span the Foreign Office, the Treasury, and the boards of two major financial institutions. A list of members in the hands of someone who knows how to read it is a map of who knows whom and who owes what to whom. But it was a secondary matter. The primary object was M.D. Here, for the first time, something moved in Hale's face. Not much. A fractional adjustment around the eyes. M.D. had been, for some months, assembling evidence of your operations within the mission. He was thorough, and he was quiet, qualities that, ironically, are precisely what made him useful to the mission and what made him dangerous to you. He had not yet gone to the Foreign Office because he was building a case sufficient to be irrefutable rather than merely suggestive. A careful man. A very careful man, Hale said. It was the first thing he had said since sitting down, delivered in the neutral tone of a man making an observation rather than a concession. He was careful, Holmes agreed. But he communicated with his superiors at the mission through a channel that you had access to through Vandermeer, who by this point was no longer a willing participant, but a man too deeply compromised to refuse. You learned that M.D. was within weeks of completing his evidence. You moved. Holmes rose and went to the window, and looked out at Baker Street for a moment with his hands behind his back before turning. The scene at Buckingham Palace, he said, was not a crime committed at Buckingham Palace. It was a communication sent from Buckingham Palace. M.D., realizing that his movements were being observed and that he was running out of time, used the one resource available to him, that you could not anticipate his knowledge of the palace's East Corridor, acquired during the diplomatic residence, and specifically his knowledge of an irregularity in the Belgian suite's antechamber that the household staff had not yet addressed. Holmes paused. There is a loose panel behind the door of that antechamber. Watson the Fenwick. It conceals a shallow cavity approximately 18 inches by 12, used in an earlier era for the storage of correspondence during particularly sensitive diplomatic visits. It is not on any current record of the palace's interior. M.D. knew of it because Vandermeer told him in one of their conversations, and Vandermeer knew of it because he had discovered it himself during the residence. I had not known about the panel. I had not known that Holmes had found it. I absorbed this without expression, though I felt the habitual mild frustration of discovering that Holmes had been several steps ahead of where he permitted me to see. M.D. used the panel to conceal a document, Holmes continued. The document was a summary of his evidence, not the full evidence itself, which was too large to conceal there, but a trace sufficient to identify the scope and nature of what he had gathered. He then created the scene in the corridor, the blood, the handprint, the cufflink bearing his initials as a signal. Not to the police, not to the palace household, to a specific individual at the Foreign Office who would understand the significance of blood in the palace East Corridor, who would know that the investigation would bring someone to examine that antechamber, and who would retrieve the document from the panel when the moment was safe. The sitting room was very still. The blood, I said slowly. It was his own. "A deliberate self-injury," Holmes confirmed. "Sufficient to be alarming, insufficient to be incapacitating." MD was, as Hale has just confirmed, a careful man. He calculated the quantity required to ensure the scene would be taken seriously, and remained within the survivable margin. He then walked with some difficulty, I imagine, through the servants' passage to the south gate, which he had already arranged to have unlocked through a contact I have not yet identified, and left the palace before Crale's midnight round. "He was not in the crate," I said. "He was in the crate," Holmes said, "but not on the night of the palace scene. He had already been taken 3 days earlier, before he could act, before the document was concealed. Someone moved too quickly. Someone who had access to MD's schedule and knew he was close to acting." Holmes looked at Hale directly. "The palace scene was not MD's first attempt. It was his second. The first attempt, the meeting he had arranged with his Foreign Office contact, was intercepted. He was taken that night, sedated and transported to Dymchurch. The scene at the palace was created by the Foreign Office contact, acting on Mr. D's prior instructions, using the materials Mr. D had prepared." I stared at Holmes, then at Hale, then back at Holmes. "There were 2 people," I said. "2 people involved in creating the palace scene. Mr. D is contact, who set the blood and the cufflink and the handprint, and someone else who picked the courtyard gate." "The contact had assistants," Holmes said. "The identity of the assistant is the one element I have not yet established to my complete satisfaction." He held Hale's eyes. "Though I suspect that Mr. Hale, who sent his own man to observe the palace's aftermath and who arranged for Mrs. Petch's testimony and for the floor plan in Holst's wainscoting, may be able to confirm whether his surveillance of the event gave him a view of the assistant's identity." Hale was quiet for a moment. "You are very thorough, Mr. Holmes," he said at last. "I am adequately thorough," Holmes said. "The document in the panel, I removed it on my second visit to the palace, which I conducted without Waverley's knowledge. It is currently in Mycroft's possession. MD's full evidence is being assembled by the Foreign Office contact, who is now in communication with my brother. What you assembled over 4 years, Mr. Hale, has been assembled against you in 4 days." He paused. "The question before us now is not whether this ends. It is how." Hale looked at his hat on his knee. He turned the brim once in his fingers, the only gesture of the meeting that was not entirely controlled. "You said in your note," he said, "that there was a proposition." "There is," Holmes said. "And it comes not from me but from Mycroft, which means it comes from a level of the British government that does not commit to propositions it does not intend to honor." He leaned forward slightly. "August Renner, his network, the 2 foreign intelligence services that have been purchasing your material. You will provide a complete account, every transaction, every contact, every document exchanged in exchange for which the prosecution of Cornelius Hale for the unlawful imprisonment of Mrs. D will be suspended, not dismissed, and your travel will be restricted to a perimeter that Mycroft will define, and you will not conduct any further intelligence work of any kind for any party for the remainder of your life." Hale absorbed this. "Suspended," he said, "not dismissed." "Mycroft does not dismiss things," Holmes said. "He suspends them. It is a meaningful distinction. A suspended prosecution can be reinstated. A dismissed one cannot. You will be, for the rest of your life, a man who has something to lose." Holmes held his eyes. "That is the proposition." Another silence, longer than the last. "The assistant," Hale said finally, "who helped the Foreign Office contact at the palace. You genuinely do not know?" "I have a candidate," Holmes said. "I would rather have a confirmation." Hale considered the hat on his knee for the last time. Then he looked up, and something in his face, the absolute composure, the 63 years of professional containment shifted in a way that I found unexpectedly somewhat affecting. Not remorse, nothing so simple. Something more like the exhaustion of a man who has held a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally been offered a surface to set it on. "His name is Edmund Cartwright," he said. I caught my breath. Holmes did not move. "Cartwright was MD's Foreign Office contact," he said. Not a question. Cartwright was MD's Foreign Office contact, his assistant in the palace scene, and the man who came to me not to Holst with information about MD's investigation. He was feeding you and feeding me simultaneously, Mr. Holmes. A pause. He is rather better at this than his manner suggests. Holmes sat with this for a moment. Then he said very quietly, with a quality in his voice that I can only call respect, even if a complicated kind, He came to Baker Street and gave evidence that freed Holst. He showed Watson the rope marks on his wrists. He performed the role of MD's loyal but frightened ally with complete conviction. A pause. And he was protecting MD the entire time by ensuring that our investigation moved in precisely the right direction. At some personal risk, Hale said, with what might have been, in different circumstances, professional admiration. Considerable personal risk, Holmes agreed. He rose. He extended his hand across the space between their chairs. Hale looked at it for a moment. Then he shook it with the brief, firm grip of a man concluding a negotiation he has not won but has survived. "My brother will expect you at 3 o'clock, Holmes said. A car will come at 2:30. I recommend you bring nothing that you would not wish examined." Hale stood, put on his hat with the automatic precision of long habit, and moved to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at Holmes. "The blood on the palace marble," he said. "When you first examined it, before you found the panel, before you knew what the scene meant, did you know it was not what it appeared to be?" Holmes considered the question with genuine seriousness. "I knew it was disproportionate," he said. "The scene was too clean, the blood too isolated, the corridor otherwise too undisturbed. A man who bleeds that much in a struggle does not produce only a pool. He produces a story. The corridor told no story." He paused. "I knew it was a message before I knew what it said. That is the most I can claim." Hale nodded once. Then he went downstairs, and Mrs. Hudson let him out, and the front door closed, and Baker Street received him, and proceeded about its business as though nothing of any particular consequence had occurred. Holmes stood at the window and watched him walk away. "Cartwright," I said. "Cartwright," Holmes confirmed without turning. "You knew?" "Before Hale told you. I suspected very strongly after he came to Baker Street. The rope marks were real. I believe he was genuinely threatened. But the precision with which he delivered his information, the perfect calibration of what he revealed and what he withheld, the way his account of the cord marks served simultaneously as evidence of threat and as a vector for redirecting our attention." Holmes turned. "He is, as Hale said, rather better at this than he appears, which is, of course, the point of him. Will he face consequences?" Holmes moved back to his chair and sat with the long, settling movement of a man who has been standing for a very long time. "That," he said, "is a question for Mycroft, and Mycroft, in matters of this kind, tends to find that the most useful people are the ones who are owed the most careful management." The ghost of a smile. "Cartwright will be fine, Watson. He did what he set out to do at considerable personal cost, and the man he was protecting is alive and in a Bloomsbury hotel ordering breakfast as we speak. And Vandermeer?" "Vandermeer," Holmes said, "was a weak man used by clever ones. He will face some consequence for the membership list, but the full weight of prosecution will fall on Renner's network where it belongs." He reached for his pipe and this time lit it, and leaned back in his chair, and looked at the ceiling with the slow exhalation of a man returning by degrees to himself. "We are, I think, at the end of it." Outside London went on. "We are, I think, at the end of it." Outside London went on.